As the last rays of sunlight slip slowly behind the high mud-brick walls of the ancient city, casting long, soft shadows across the dusty courtyards and narrow alleys of Babylon, the day begins to release its grip on the air, the dry heat loosening, slightly as dusk settles in like a quiet breath exhaled across stone, and the great ziggurat in the distance stands bathed in the pale orange light of sunset, its tiers now darkening one by one as the sun continues its slow retreat, while in the shadow of this great structure, in a modest home built of sun-dried clay and roofed with woven reeds and beams, the rhythm of daily life gently turns inward. And within this home, tucked between others in a winding row that follows the narrow curve of a side street, a woman leans against the frame of her doorway, watching the sky turn a deeper blue, her hands still coated with traces of flour from the evening meal, and her eyes blinking slowly against the last of the light, not with fatigue but with the calm that comes only when the hardest work of the day is behind her. And inside, the house is dim and warm, the walls holding onto the day's heat like a memory not yet ready to fade, and the single oil lamp set on the low clay shelf flickers softly, casting shadows that dance across the uneven surface of the wall, elongating the curved outline of a clay jug, the handle of a wooden spoon, the edge of a woven basket that holds figs and barley bread, and the scent of the household is rich and layered, not overpowering but deeply familiar. The faint smokiness from the tandoor oven, the slightly sweet note of crushed dates, the musky trace of linen drying near the hearth, and underneath it all, the earthy scent of the clay itself. And from the other side of the room comes the quiet shifting of a child settling onto a sleeping mat, his arms wrapped around a smooth, sun-warmed pillow stuffed with sheep's wool, his eyes heavy but not yet closed, watching the shadows with quiet fascination as his mother moves gently through the room, brushing crumbs from the floor with a reed broom, placing a folded cloth over the mouth of a water jar, adjusting the position of a stool so that it will not catch the morning light too harshly when the sun rises. And outside, the sounds of the street grow fewer, as neighbors finish their conversations, as animals are tied and fed. As the last footsteps echo past and fade toward silence, replaced by the soft chorus of insects beginning to hum in the cool night air and the distant echoing bark of a dog too far away to disturb. And the woman, now finished with her small tasks, lowers herself onto a woven mat near the hearth, her knees drawn loosely beneath her, and she breathes in deeply, letting the quiet of the house settle over her like a warm, familiar blanket, letting the sounds of the city dim, letting the rhythm of her breath match the flicker of the lamp, and in that stillness, in that small, enclosed world of stone and shadow and memory, the night begins in earnest, not with noise, not with ceremony, but with a slow folding inward, a retreat from the heat, from the sun, from the demands of the outer world, into the timeless space of a Babylonian home, where silence and simplicity hold the weight of an entire civilization's evening. As twilight deepens into full night, and the light of the oil lamp becomes the sole illumination in the quiet room, casting its steady, flickering glow across the walls and ceiling, like a silent firefly suspended in clay, the woman moves with practiced ease through the slow, deliberate ritual of preparing the sleeping space for her family, a task that is neither rushed nor burdened with urgency, but rather one of those end-of-day movements performed so often that her body remembers them more easily than thought, her hands unfolding mats woven from palm fronds and laid with care across the smoothed earthen floor, each mat carefully placed, with its corners flattened, its edges aligned, so that each member of the household may lie in comfort through the long, still hours of the desert night. And though the room is not large, its space is organized with an order shaped by rhythm and repetition. The mats placed near the inner wall to avoid the draft from the entrance, the woven storage baskets nudged gently to the side, the clay water jar resting close enough for night thirst to be satisfied without rising, and over each mat she lays a soft covering made of finely woven wool, dyed faintly with crushed madder root and rinsed in the cool water of the canal weeks. Gergo when the dyeing was done, now dry and warm and holding the subtle earthy scent of the reeds from the riverbank, and she smooths each cover with her palms, pressing the folds flat, tucking in the corners, not because anyone will see or judge her care, but because it is the rhythm of her hands, the same way she brushes crumbs from the threshold or adjusts the lamp's wick, a quiet pride in the order of things that need no audience. And outside, the city speaks in whispers now, the murmur of voices through brick walls fading further, replaced by the occasional creak of wood as another door is latched for the night, or the low thud of a clay jar being set onto a shelf. And within her own walls the quiet is even deeper, the small sounds of a home in rest, the soft exhale of sleeping children, the gentle crackle of the last glowing coal in the hearth, the rhythmic flutter of a linen curtain stirred by the night breeze. And she sits back on her heels, arms at her sides, eyes closed for a moment as if to listen more deeply, not to the city but to the house itself, to the silent gratitude of stone and mat and air and breath. And then she leans forward again, reaching into a small carved chest. At the corner of the room where she keeps the family's few treasured comforts, a piece of polished shell for the youngest to hold, a woolen wrap for the eldest, who often rises cold in the early morning. And she places these with the same tenderness with which she sets a fig on a plate or folds the child's tunic at sunrise. And the lamp burns lower now, its light golden and tired, casting longer shadows on the uneven wall, and still she does not hurry, for the night is long, and time here moves differently, not in the measured ticks of some faraway clock, but in the bending of breath and the flicker of firelight, in the softness of hands on fabric, in the comfort of completing tasks that countless other women have done before her. And as the last mat is prepared, and she lowers herself into her place, pulling the wool wrap over her legs and resting her head against the rolled edge of the bedding, she lets the hush surround her fully now, letting the weight of the day fall away, not in exhaustion but in quiet fullness, in the way a house sighs with its family at rest, in the way a room filled with sleeping breath becomes not just shelter, but a vessel for dreams carried gently into the waiting dark. As the soft hum of the oil lamp dims further, and the last glowing ember in the hearth surrenders its light to the surrounding darkness, the quiet inside the home becomes so complete that even the smallest sounds seem to stretch outward, filling the space with an intimacy that only night can bring. And the woman, though her body has relaxed into the warmth of the woven mat, and her head rests against the soft curve of a bundled cloth, remains awake for a little while longer, not restless, not troubled, but simply attuned to the subtle symphony that begins. Once the bustle of day has withdrawn, and through the thick clay walls of her home, baked hard by the sun and smoothed by generations of hands, she hears the city in its nocturnal rhythm, not loud, not insistent, but steady and textured, like a slow-moving river flowing just beyond reach. The creaking of a gate being secured with a wooden latch, the soft brush of reed sandals against stone, as a neighbor makes one last trip to check on the animals or fetch water from the shared cistern, the low murmur of voices drifting from a rooftop where the night air is cooler and some families still linger in quiet conversation, their words softened by distance into indistinct threads of tone and breath. And from farther off, she catches the uneven clop of a donkey's hooves as it moves along the edge of the city, likely led by a merchant who prefers to travel under the cover of night, his goods wrapped in cloth, his pace slow but purposeful, and this sound, though faint, stirs a memory in her, not a sharp image, but a familiar feeling of another night, long ago when she herself returned from her mother's house with a small basket in hand, and the moonlight tracing her shadow across the alley, and she listens not with longing, but with the quiet acceptance that life moves forward in circles, that today's sounds are echoes of yesterday's, and that the walls that surround her are not just barriers, but keepers of all those sounds, all those nights, each one folded gently into the next. And closer now, she hears the soft breathing of her children, the occasional shift of a limb against the mat, the barely audible sigh of a child slipping deeper into sleep, and these small sounds ground her more than any spoken word could, for they are the sounds of safety, of shelter, of time held still within a single space. And outside again the wind moves through the narrow streets, stirring the fine dust that never truly settles, rattling a loose reed blind somewhere along the eastern wall, and for a moment she can even hear the distant lap of water against stone, perhaps from the Euphrates itself, or maybe from one of the smaller canals that snake quietly through the city, feeding the gardens and washing the feet of the foundations of this world built in brick and sun. And all these sounds, layered so gently over the silence, create a kind of music that requires no melody, a kind of comfort that reaches her not through touch, but through presence. And as her eyes close at last and her breath falls into the slow rhythm of rest, the city continues its quiet watch, holding her and her home in the soft embrace of shadow, brick and time, whispering the lullabies of the past into the cool air of a night. As the deep stillness of night settles more fully over the city and the noises of the streets soften into mere impressions, the home becomes a haven of near-total quiet, broken only by the natural rhythm of breathing bodies and the occasional creak of woven mats shifting beneath relaxed limbs. And from where the woman lies, her back curled slightly toward the warmth of the clay wall, she can see, if she opens her eyes just slightly, the faintest shimmer of moonlight filtering down through the spaces between the tightly bound reeds of the roof, a silver web of light that dances almost imperceptibly on the surface of the opposite wall. And this light, though faint, is enough to give shape to the outlines of the room, revealing the curve of a clay bowl left near the hearth, the folds of a woolen cloth slung over a beam, the rounded edge of a storage jar painted with simple, fading lines that were once bright with ochre and blue. And the woman, still not fully asleep, lets her gaze rest on these gentle shapes, as if reading the room like a quiet book, each object holding a story too small to speak aloud, but large enough to comfort, each one a reminder of the life she lives. The bowl once carried lentils for a feast at her cousin's celebration. The cloth was woven by her sister on a loom in the alley during a summer long gone. The jar came as part of a wedding gift, its lid chipped slightly from a careless bump years ago, but still it holds its purpose. And the moonlight, quiet and impartial, touches each item the same, giving no more attention to the beautiful than to the plain, bathing the home in its pale grace as though it, too, understands the sacredness of what is ordinary. And as this soft light continues to drift through the reed cover, she imagines the night sky above it, vast and wide, scattered with stars whose names she does not know, but whose presence she can feel. And she thinks of how many other homes in the city lie beneath this same sky, how many other women in other rooms, just like this one, are lying in the same quiet position, half asleep, half dreaming, their eyes tracing the same patchwork of moonlight, their minds drifting between the weight of the day and the pull of dreams. And she breathes in slowly, the air still holding a faint echo of warmth from the walls, and the scent of dust and dry reeds and old smoke mixes gently with the cooler trace of the night air, slipping in through a crack in the plaster near the door frame. And she wonders, without effort, what tomorrow will bring. Whether the merchant will pass with fresh fruits, whether the neighbor's goat will again stray into the shared courtyard, whether her son will finally catch the rhythm of his lessons. And these thoughts do not agitate her, but instead lull her further into stillness. For they are not problems, but patterns, the repeated stitches of a life woven slowly, patiently, with hands and time. And as her breath deepens and the shadows on the wall shift ever so slightly with the breeze, she lets her eyes close completely, the moonlight still dancing faintly behind her lids, and the night holds her gently, like a long quiet song sung without words, a lullaby of earth and roof, of moon and breath, of home. As the hour grows later and the city sinks deeper into its nighttime hush, a weightless kind of silence settles over the walls of the home. Not the silence of emptiness, but the full, textured silence that only comes in the deepest part of the night, when the last murmurs of conversation have long since faded into memory, and the last footsteps down the alley have become echoes rather than events. And it is in this cocoon of stillness that the woman, resting now more fully beneath her woolen covering, notices something she could not sense while the house was alive with movement and voices, a smell so faint, so embedded in the walls themselves, that only the absence of all other distractions allows it to rise and be felt, the scent of earth and clay, the true perfume of her home. And it is not unpleasant, not damp or sharp, but warm and grounding, a dry, ancient smell carried in the very bones of the bricks, made of sun-baked mud, straw and dust, gathered from riverbanks and courtyards and the soft beds of old floodwaters, clay that remembers the rains of past seasons and the footsteps of those who carried it. And the scent reaches her not through breath alone, but as a memory felt through skin and rhythm and heartbeat, the way one remembers a song, not because it plays, but because something in the silence still holds its melody, and the room around her, though dark, feels visible in the mind's eye, her awareness stretching beyond her closed eyelids to recall each curve and edge, each tool and textile resting in its place. The tall jar near the door with the woven lid that creaks faintly in the wind, the hanging shelf of dried herbs, tied in bundles with old thread, and humming faintly with the scent of fennel and bay leaf. The cracked surface of the hearth, blackened at the edges and still warm with the breath of extinguished coals, and all of this wrapped in the earthy scent that rises like steam from a sun-warmed street after rain, makes her feel not confined, but comforted, as if the house itself were alive. Not just shelter, but presence. Not just structure, but companion. And she thinks for a brief passing moment about the house as it was built, how someone many years ago, a man perhaps, or many, guided by the same hands that now shape ovens and grindstones, stacked the bricks row by row, smoothed the mortar, fitted the beams, bent their backs under the same sun that still watches over the city, and how those hands have vanished into time but remain in the walls just as hers will one day, remain in the reed-woven mat, and the faint stains in the kitchen clay, and the worn edge of the doorframe polished by passing palms. And with this thought, she feels no sadness, only a kind of deep restfulness, the kind that belongs not to the body but to the spirit, to the rootedness of a life so deeply entwined with its place that it does not end, only changes form. And she breathes again, slower. Now the air of the home filling her lungs not just with oxygen, but with presence, with something old and quiet and steady. And in that breath, she finds sleep at last, not sudden or abrupt, but like a tide rising around her, gentle and cool, drawing her into its embrace with the slow rhythm of clay and air and night. As the deep night continues to unfold, with the measured quiet of stars turning slowly over the city, the home remains wrapped in shadow and stillness, its clay walls holding onto the memory of the sun, even as the outside world cools into silence. And from her place on the mat, the woman stirs only slightly, shifting the fold of her covering across her legs while her ears, still half awake though her mind drifts into that liminal space between sleep and memory, catch the soft, rhythmic breathing of her youngest child, who lies curled beside her, small limbs tucked beneath a woven wrap, one hand resting open on the mat as if to catch dreams, and the child's breath is a quiet whisper, a gentle tide of inhale and exhale that echoes the hush of the wind passing across the rooftops, and with each breath, the child's body rises and falls so gently that it seems he is floating on an invisible current, adrift in the weightless ocean of sleep. And the woman listens not with worry, but with the reverent stillness of someone bearing witness to something precious and fragile, not in danger, but in grace, for there is something in the softness of a child's sleep that pulls time into itself, suspending the worries of grain tallies and laundry and leaky jugs, reducing the complexity of life into this single, wondrous rhythm of peace. And she remembers, as she always does when watching him sleep, the night he was born, the way the reed lamp flickered too brightly in the wind, the way her sister hummed a chant while mixing warm water in the clay basin, the way his first breath broke the silence, not like a cry but like a thread being pulled through cloth, sharp and sudden and whole. And now, years later, here he is, sleeping in the same house where his father once ran barefoot between jars and jugs, where his grandmother once hung aprons to dry in the heat, where so many lives have echoed one into the next without ever needing to be written down. And outside, the moon has passed its highest point and now casts softer, more slanted beams across the city's rooftops, spilling in through the gaps in the reed thatch and laying silver stripes across the mat where the child sleeps, lighting his cheek, his hair, the curve of his shoulder, and illuminating the fine particles of dust that float silently in the air above him. And the woman, still wrapped in warmth and wakeful thought, reaches out slowly and gently adjusts the edge of his covering, tucking it back around his feet, which have nudged themselves free in some unseen movement. And when she pulls her hand away, she does so with the kind of tenderness that only comes from many, many nights like this, the kind of gesture that requires no thought, no effort, only love shaped into habit. And as her hand returns to rest, At her side, and her eyes begin to close once more. The breath of the night surrounds her again, this invisible presence that moves in through the cracks, through the woven roof, over the surface of the clay walls, and around her sleeping child, and she breathes it in, the cool. Clean air that smells faintly of reeds and old stone and ash and distance, and lets it fill her chest with a slow calm, and with that final exhale, she releases the last threads of the day's thoughts, not erasing them, but folding them away. Like cloths return to their basket, letting the rhythm of the child's breath become her own, and letting the night continue its slow, endless unfolding beyond the walls of the house. As the hours pass gently, and the home breathes in harmony with the slowness of night, there comes a subtle shift in the balance of silence, not enough to wake, not sudden or sharp, but the kind of quiet change that only becomes noticeable in stillness so deep it carries the sound of its own heart, and beneath the rounded arch of the hearth, where the fire was allowed to die down hours ago after the last pot was lifted and the embers were left untended, a small stirring begins, not because anyone rises, not because anything is needed, but simply because fire, even when forgotten, has a way of continuing its slow dance beneath the ash, and within the fine powder of grey-white soot that now lines the bowl of clay where coals once burned brightly. A faint glow still lingers, hidden under its own blanket of cooled ash, pulsing quietly like the last memory of the sun beneath the earth, and as the night air cools just enough to kiss the edge of the clay floor with a faint chill, the residual warmth beneath the hearth becomes more noticeable, not in temperature, alone but in presence, in the way it softly presses outward against the coolness that now fills the rest of the room, like a body asleep beneath a light shawl, barely moving, barely seen, and a single small coal, still alive with heat, shifts, slightly causing a gentle crackle that is no louder than a sigh, and a thin trail of warmth rises invisibly into the room, bringing with it a faint scent, something between burnt wood and cooked grain, and the sweetness of dates that had once simmered over its flame. And the woman, not fully awake, but not quite asleep, feels it rather than hears it. This warm breath from the earth below her, and in her mind she drifts briefly into the rhythm of the fire's memory, the way it had once roared for baking, the hiss of water dropped into its center, the sharp smell of wet kindling, the steady glow it cast against, the wall when the sun had gone, and it reminds her in a way she does not try to grasp fully, of the rhythm of time itself, how everything burns and softens and cools and then begins again, not as fire always, but as presence, as process, as the simple persistence of warmth within cold and motion within stillness. And she imagines, for a long moment, how many nights this hearth has seen, how many embers have glowed in that same curve of clay since the house was first built, how many pots have rested on its edge, and how many hands have stirred grain and beans while the fire offered its slow blessing. And outside the house, beyond its thick walls, the city lies quiet. The alleys turn silver with moonlight, the doorways still, the rooftops bathed in shadow and sky, and the stars pass overhead in their wide, patient arcs, as they have for generations, unmoved by flame or sleep or breath. And inside, the room holds onto its warmth with grace, and the hearth, now quiet but not cold, continues to pulse in its tiny, hidden way, offering its warmth not to be used, not to be seen, but simply to be known. And as the woman settles more deeply into her mat, her breathing quieting into the same slow rhythm as the night, the hearth, the child, and the city around her, the small coal at the center of the ash glows one last time, softly and briefly, as if exhaling its memory into the room, then rests waiting for morning. As the moon arcs farther across the night sky, and the stars shimmer above the slumbering rooftops of Babylon like silent watchers from another world, the temperature within the clay-walled home begins to shift again, descending ever so slightly. With each hour past, and from the narrow, weathered cracks in the wall, those thin lines where sun-dried bricks never sealed entirely against time, a wind begins to whisper. Not a gust or a draught, but something more delicate, more deliberate, as if the night itself were weaving its fingers softly through the seams of the home, checking each crevice for signs of waking, sending cool air to caress the warm surfaces, where sleep clings. And this wind is not unwelcome, for though it carries the desert's nighttime breath, it is gentle, tempered by distance and dust, by the scent of dry palms and the water canals that still shimmer faintly under starlight. And it curls its way across the packed earth floor like a guest too polite to announce itself, trailing softly over sleeping limbs, under baskets around the curved edge of a stool, until it reaches the back wall, where it nudges at a reed curtain just enough to stir its fibers with a soft rustle, like the brush of a hand over woven cloth. And in her half-sleep, the woman feels this presence without needing to name it, her mind adjusting not to alarm but to awareness, as if the house itself is exhaling and she is breathing in reply, and she shifts slightly, not to hide from the wind but to feel it more completely, letting the breeze move across her cheek through her hair, beneath the folds of the woolen wrap that warms her legs. And the air brings with it stories from the outside, not in words, but in temperature and texture. The cooler touch that tells of still water beneath the moon, the dry note that hints at stone roads finally free of footsteps, the faintest fragrance of distant firewood smouldering in some other home, another hearth where someone else is just now falling asleep, and this connectedness, this invisible thread drawn through the night from one family to the next, feels to her like a song without melody, a rhythm of life that moves softly through space and time, where even the breath of air has memory and meaning. And as she listens, truly listens, she can almost feel the layers of years beneath the wind, how this same current once blew through the house when her mother slept in this room, when she was still a girl bundled in smaller cloths, and perhaps even before, when the walls were newly built and the cracks less deep, when everything was still finding its shape and scent and silence, and yet the wind remains the same, unchanging in its purpose, faithful in its passage, like a messenger that forgets nothing but speaks only in breath. And it moves now, across her son's forehead, lifting a few strands of his sleep-tossed hair, brushing his brow with such delicacy that he stirs, murmurs a soft, shapeless sound, then falls still again, and the mother smiles faintly in the dark, her lips barely moving, her heart beating slowly beneath the wool and linen and the weight of 100 quiet nights. And she welcomes the wind, not as disturbance, but as reminder that the world continues to move even while she sleeps, that the stars do not wait, that the city inhales and exhales with her through clay, through reed, through breath, through wind. As the house continues to rest in its envelope of deep night silence, every corner wrapped in shadow and breath, every surface stilled beneath the softness of starlight and the patient pulse of time, the woman begins to drift more deeply into the layered quiet of sleep. Yet even as her body settles more completely beneath the warmth of the woolen wrap, her mind, unbound by the weight of tasks or the sharp edges of thought, moves gently through memory, not with force or intention, but with the smooth drift of a reed boat following a slow current. And from this place of warmth and stillness rises the vivid impression of crushed barley, not in the form of a waking thought, but as a scent that emerges in the mind's night air, familiar and thick with meaning, the warm, nutty fragrance that comes in the earliest hours when the sun is only beginning to touch the tops of the walls and the first sounds of the day have not yet begun. And in this half-dream, half-memory, she finds herself in the small courtyard behind the house where the grinding stones rest on a low platform of fired clay, where a round basket of dry golden barley waits to be poured and the air is still cool from the night. And her fingers move by habit to the wooden scoop, lifting the grains in small handfuls and scattering them gently across the flat top stone, their rounded forms clicking softly against the surface like tiny pebbles. And the scent begins not when the grains are whole, but when the top stone moves over them, slow and circular, pressing and breaking and releasing the pale powder of the inner seed, and it is then that the smell begins to rise, filling the courtyard like a blessing, like the very spirit of morning itself, earthy and rich and alive with promise. And in her memory she can feel the smooth handle of the grinding stone, shaped perfectly to the palm after years of use, and she remembers the way her shoulders used to ache from the repetition when she was younger, before the motion became natural, before the rhythm of stone against stone became almost musical in its pattern. And around her, in the morning scene her mind recreates, she can hear the other sounds that always come with this hour, the cooing of doves roosting in the high beams above the wall, the distant bark of a dog already restless, the first echo of a merchant's cart dragging across the street, all of it woven gently beneath the louder, deeper sound of grinding grain. And in that courtyard the smell lingers even after the flour has been gathered, clinging to the baskets, to the clay, to the folds of the tunic she wears, and even later, when the bread bakes in the earthen. Avalon fills the home with its own delicious scent. The memory of the barley remains more distinct, more foundational, as if it is the beginning of every day, the root of nourishment and motion and routine. And as the woman sleeps more fully now, her face relaxed into the faintest smile, her brow smooth, her breath deepening with each cycle, the memory of barley settles inside her like a lullaby, soft and grainy and warm, wrapping around her thoughts like flower dust in sunlight, leaving no weight, only presence. And in the real room where she lies still on the mat, the air is cooler now, the hearth has gone fully dark, and the night continues to hold her gently, cradling the fragments of her memory and the rhythm of her body in the same silence, the same clay, the same city that has tasted barley in the morning for thousands of years. As the stillness of night deepens, and the home remains cocooned in its hush of woven shadows, smooth walls and breath-softened air, there is one object in the room that does not sleep, not because it moves or breathes, but because it holds, within its small unchanging shape, the watchfulness of generations. A quiet sentinel suspended from a loop of twine near the doorframe, where it catches neither the lamp's glow nor the eye of any passerby, unless they are looking for it with memory rather than sight. And this object, the amulet of the woman's mother's mother, carved from a piece of river-polished stone and inlaid faintly with a line of dark blue glaze that time has worn to near invisibility, is a thing so old and so ordinary in its place that it has become almost part of the wall itself. And yet tonight, in the rhythm of half-sleep and slow dreams, its presence hums in the woman's mind like a low drumbeat beneath water. For it is not just a trinket or decoration, but a vessel of comfort, a fragment of the past suspended in the present, holding in its weightless form the warmth of hands that once believed in its power, that whispered prayers into the clay as it dried, that tied the cord with fingers worn, from grinding, weaving, mending. And in the way only sleep can allow, the woman's thoughts drift not with words but with feeling toward the stories she was told as a child about this amulet. How it was once hung from the neck of a young bride on her way into a new household, how it passed through fire when a clay roof collapsed during a storm, how it once dangled above the woven cradle of her eldest uncle before he was named, how it traveled wrapped in wool from one village to another when the river flooded and the streets turned to silt. And now here it hangs, still, untouched. In weeks or months, yet trusted in a quiet way to continue doing what it has always done, not shielding the house with some invisible magic, but anchoring it gently, reminding its walls and those who sleep within them that they are part of something older than fear, older than even memory. And the woman, whose back faces the door and whose eyes remain closed, does not need to turn or reach for it, for she can feel its presence in the way the air cools slightly near the entrance, in the way the room seems to hold together at night like a single breathing body, in the way she has never once crossed the threshold without some unconscious glance toward that spot above the lintel where the loop of twine hangs, and even her son, too young to know its story, too small to remember the shape, sometimes looks toward it before leaving for the day, and sometimes, not often, touches it with the tip of a finger before stepping out into the street, as if drawn by instinct. And outside, the wind passes softly, the city wall groans faintly in its sleep, and the stars slide imperceptibly westward, but inside the amulet remains untouched, unmoving, a point of perfect stillness within the house, a stone between breaths, holding not protection exactly, but continuity, the kind of comfort that cannot be worn down by time or forgotten by silence. And as the woman breathes deeply and fully now, her body heavy with rest and her mind drifting farther from the waking world, the amulet holds its place with quiet dignity, glowing not with light but with presence, with the weight of all the nights it has watched, all the women it has outlived, all the homes it has helped feel whole. As the night stretches onward, not in silence exactly, but in that particular stillness shaped by the quiet continuation of hidden sounds, the home breathes alongside the resting bodies within it, and somewhere just beyond its thick clay walls, perhaps past 2 narrow alleys and beyond a low archway, where reeds grow in clusters, near the broken edge of an old water trough. The gentle voice of moving water rises faintly into the air, not loud enough to disturb, not rhythmic enough to mark time, but present in the way distant memories linger without form. And this sound, this barely audible trickle of water passing, over stone becomes, in the woman's sleep-laden mind, not just background but texture, something woven into the very architecture of her rest, like the soft threads of a worn blanket pulled up over the mind, anchoring her to the world beyond the mat. And though she does not wake, not fully, her ears tilt slightly in her dream toward that sound, and her body, wrapped loosely in wool and warmed by the breath of the boy beside her, adjusts by the smallest degree, as if aligning itself more closely with that ancient murmur that she has heard in some form or another every night of her life. For the canals of Babylon do not sleep, and the Euphrates, broad and slow and patient, moves through the night with a majesty that asks for no audience, its currents carrying not only water but time, memory, grain husks, fish bones, the dreams of brickworkers and night guards and scribes who walked too late. And the woman, though not consciously aware of all this, absorbs it in the way one absorbs the sun through skin or stories through silence, her breath deepening in response to that subtle lull, her mind sliding more easily into the vast river of sleep that connects all those who lie beneath the same sky, beneath the same clay, beneath the same constellation of worries and joys that change shape each day and return again with morning. And she remembers, though she is not awake, a time when she was small and frightened and could not sleep, and her mother took her to the canal's edge, just near the edge of the date grove, and dipped a reed cup into the water, letting her drink slowly, while the sound of it rushed around them like voices whispering only kindness. And that night she fell asleep beneath a woven palm mat, with the cup still in her hand. And so now, decades later, that sound, faint, distant, unshaped by walls, still touches the same quiet space inside her, not just calming but restoring, a breath drawn from the water and returned to the earth with gratitude. And she dreams, not vividly but peacefully, of water passing over, clay jars left too close to the edge, of the ripple made by a small fish beneath a floating lotus leaf, of the soft hush of a paddle against a boat's side, of cool water trickling through cupped hands, of time flowing forward without breaking, without haste, without resistance. And in this dream, the city never sleeps but only softens, the ziggurat in the distance turning to silhouette, the alleyways shimmering with moonlight and shadow, the canals murmuring their secrets to the stones, and in the heart of one quiet house, a woman sleeps, with her ear turned toward the ancient language of water, and the water, steady and eternal, continues to speak. As the final hours of night tip gently toward dawn, but still hold firmly to the silence of deepest sleep, the room remains bathed in a softened darkness, touched only by the faintest prelude of morning light beginning to stir beyond the reed-covered roof. And within this hush, the shadows on the wall, once sharp and dancing under the oil lamp's flutter, have now stretched and flattened, their edges smoothed by the passage of time and the cooling of the air. And among them, most visible of all, are the gentle outlines of reed baskets, hanging in their usual places from wooden pegs pressed deep into the clay. And these baskets, so ordinary by day, holding lentils or tools or pieces of string, become something else entirely at night, their woven bodies casting fragile interlaced patterns against the wall that ripple ever so slightly with the movement of the air, like lace made of silence. And the woman, though asleep, rests beneath these shadows as if beneath a canopy, her dreams passing gently through the same woven logic that shaped the baskets, over and under, loop and twist, rhythm and utility, a harmony built by hand and repetition. And if one were to sit quietly in the room at this hour, still and awake, they might notice how each basket tells its own story through shape and wear. The round one near the corner, slightly frayed at the lip, where the child once tugged on it while crawling. The narrow-necked one that once held coals, and still bears a faint scent of smoke. The deep one patched with a different reed color, where a split occurred 2 winters ago. And these objects, unmoving and unvoiced, hold the language of labor, the touch of hands now resting, the memory of weight and grain and cloth, and in the way the moonlight or early starlight touches their curved sides. They seem not only to contain things, but to radiate calm as though they too are part of the night's architecture. And the woman, with her arm curled beneath her head and her son's breath warming the air just beside her, lies within this quiet composition, her body part of the room's stillness, her sleep woven into its structure, and in her dreams, perhaps without knowing why, she sees the motion of weaving, the dipping of reeds into a basin, the sharp sound of a blade slicing. Lengths, the repetition of form slowly emerging from chaos, and she feels, not thinks, but feels that this is how the night itself was made, not born from darkness but woven gently from breath and memory and care. And so the baskets, whose shadows remain unmoving through the night, become companions in the quiet, and their presence offers more than storage, more than decoration, but a kind of continuity, a stillness that has watched over generations without demand or voice. And outside the air is still cool, and the city still silent, and no birds yet call from the trees beyond the walls, and so the shadows hold, faint but loyal, and in their stillness they bless the room and the sleepers within it, and the simple beauty of the unseen care that makes a house more than shelter, but a place of rest. As the night deepens into its most silent, most sacred hour, that brief stillness before the earliest stirrings of light begin to reach the edge of the sky, the room holds its breath in shadow, the silence almost tender now, as if the house itself is wrapped in a blanket of dust and memory, and near the hearth, where the last warmth has long since faded and the ashes have cooled into a pale grey mound that no longer glows, there rests a small clay cup, uneven in shape, its rim chipped and its handle long broken off, yet still it stands, leaning slightly on the baked floor as though placed there by accident and then forgotten. And this cup, though unremarkable, by sight or worth, holds within its quiet posture the weight of so many days that it has become something more than vessel, something more than object, for it has outlived seasons and years, been held in the hands of children and elders, used to carry both water and oil, to scoop lentils or to catch leaking drips from a careless jug, and now in the quiet of the sleeping room, it rests in stillness, cradled by the silence, and though the woman sleeps soundly on her mat, her son tucked against her side, her thoughts long unmoored from the present, in some corner of her dreaming mind, the image of the cup appears, not because she is thinking of it, but because it is part of her world, part of the home she has walked through in darkness and light so many times, that its shape is etched into the very rhythm of her days. And in this drifting state between memory and rest, she recalls when the cup cracked, how it slipped from her hand one morning when she was carrying it wet from the basin, how it struck the edge of the hearth and broke, but not into pieces, just a hairline fracture, just enough to make it sing differently when set down, just enough to remind her that time moves even through stillness, and she remembers how she meant to discard it, meant to bury it in the heap beyond the wall where broken tools and worn sandals find their end. But somehow she never did, because each time she saw it, something stopped her, and over time the cup became useful again, not for drinking, not for cooking, but for holding a handful of dates, for catching a rolled-up piece of cloth, for resting a spoon, and now it simply remains beside the hearth where the fire once gave it purpose, and even though no one pays attention to it, not really, its presence is felt in the way old things are felt, not with sight, but with familiarity, with comfort. And the cup, cracked and quiet, leans ever so slightly into its own shadow, its curved edge casting a soft crescent onto the floor that echoes the moonlight far above. And though it holds nothing now, it is not empty, for it carries all the moments it once held water, all the times it was warmed by fire, all the times it was lifted and used and returned, and in this way it belongs to the night, to the room, to the family, not as something precious but as something faithful. And as the woman breathes slowly beneath her woven cover, her dreams turning to the shape of hands and clay and quiet labor, the cup waits without purpose, without pride, simply, enduring, simply being like a stone beneath the current, like a thought unspoken, like sleep itself. As the night continues its quiet descent toward dawn, and the last coldest hour creeps over the city, like a veil drawn slowly across a sleeping face, The home remains wrapped in the deep hush that only the final hours before light can bring. That rare stillness when even the smallest sounds, a rustle of linen, a creak in the wall, a breath drawn too sharply, seem suspended in time. And beneath her woolen covering, the woman lies unmoving, not because she is asleep alone, but because her body has surrendered completely to warmth, to the pull of the blanket that has settled across her shoulders and hips and legs like a second skin, a handmade shelter that carries not only heat, but memory. And this blanket, though frayed at its corners and uneven in its weave, holds a significance far greater than its appearance, for it was made by her own mother, who gathered the wool strand by strand, spinning it during quiet hours in the courtyard when the sun leaned against the far wall, weaving it through long afternoons as she listened to neighbors gossip about market prices and children's teeth, and stitched its edges in the dim light of dusk, while her hands moved with the rhythm of tradition. Passed down through generations, and now, years later, that same blanket rests on the daughter's sleeping body, heavy not just with thread but with time, its coarse fibers softening with every winter past, absorbing the scents of herbs and earth and fire and clay, shaped by the contours of the mat, the body, the years. And in this hour when the air is thinnest and the room has cooled into a still dry space filled with breath and brick and the faintest scent of last night's meal, the blanket becomes a wall against the night, not resisting it but offering comfort within it, a warm anchor to the home's heart. And in her sleep, the woman feels its weight not as pressure but as presence, the way a child feels the arm of a parent draped across their back, secure without words, comforting without thought. And, though her son beside her sleeps uncovered now, his body turned toward the clay wall that still holds a breath of warmth, she remains wrapped in that blanket as if it were not a thing but a memory, a touch, a whispered story told without voice, and her dreams shift into quiet images of wool drying on ropes stretched between courtyard posts, of fingers combing, through coarse fleece of dye boiling in a pot over the fire, deep with the scent of wildflower roots and crushed bark, of patterns chosen not for beauty but for durability, of hands brushing the finished cloth and folding it slowly, as if folding, the hours and labors of love themselves, and the blanket, pulled up just beneath her chin, remains undisturbed as she turns ever so slightly in her sleep, her breath catching for a moment before releasing again, longer now, deeper, warmer. And in that motion, the blanket adjusts too, slipping softly into the curve of her back, reaffirming its presence like a quiet guardian watching through the night. And beyond the walls, the city sighs under the weight of stars, the rooftops bathed in silver, the alleyways still waiting, but inside the house the woman sleeps soundly, protected not by locks or prayers, but by the thick, faithful cloth passed from mother to daughter, a simple woven barrier between her skin and the wind, between her dreams and the approaching light. As the final stretch of night deepens into that hushed moment, just before the blackness begins to ease into grey, when even the stars seem to slow their movement in the sky and the city lies beneath a perfect blanket of unmoving silence, the air inside the clay-walled home begins to shift ever so slightly, not because of any sudden change, but because time, like everything in this house, moves patiently, gradually, like smoke curling through an open roof or water soaking into dry earth. And with that passage comes the scent, faint at first, barely more than a memory of a smell, of burnt oil and cooled ash, remnants of a fire long extinguished, and meals, long eaten, of a lamp that had flickered too long into the evening and now rests dark on the ledge, its blackened wick curled like a dried blossom inside the lip of its basin. And this scent, so subtle and woven into the very fabric of the night, does not disturb or intrude, but instead wraps itself around the room like a veil, settling over the mat, the sleeping child, the resting woman, the smooth surfaces of clay and reed and stone, each one holding onto it as though reluctant to forget the day that has passed. And the woman, though deep in sleep, inhales this air as if it were a familiar lullaby, her lungs pulling in the traces of labor and comfort, of meal preparation and fire tending, and stories told over flickering light. And with each breath, she unconsciously remembers things her waking self would not recall. The sharp flare of oil catching flame in the early dusk, the scent of flatbread sizzling on the hearthstone, the warmth of clay against her knees as she bent to turn a pot, the way the light danced across the child's face while he ate, golden and sleepy and content, and these memories, triggered not by thought but by scent, drift gently through her sleeping mind like leaves carried down, a slow river not rushing, not clear, but present, soft, circling, and in the corners of the room, where shadow and structure meet, the scent lingers most strongly, rising from the small pile of discarded kindling beside the door, from the smear of black where the base of the lamp once overran with oil, from the streaks along the hearth where heat has etched the wall with delicate lines, and all of this forms the language of night in this home, a language not spoken but breathed, not written but remembered by the air itself. And outside, the city still holds its silence, the wind no longer stirring, the canals hushed, the rooftops glazed with starshine, and yet within the house life lingers in the smell of what was burned, what was used, what gave its warmth to the people within. And the woman turns slightly in her sleep, her brow relaxing as she shifts closer to the wall, her blanket slipping, a little with the movement, and as she exhales once more into the quiet room, the scent of ash and oil drifts over her like an invisible shawl, comforting not because it is sweet, but because it is familiar, because it speaks of labor finished, warmth offered, sustenance shared. And in this moment the house breathes too, its walls exhaling stories into the dark, its floor still warm, from the bodies it cradles. And in this harmony of scent and silence, the night continues gentle and unbroken, a space where rest is not escape but belonging. In the quietest part of the night, when the air becomes so still that even the tiniest movements seem to echo through the dark, like distant thoughts, the reed fan that hangs from the center beam above the room's low ceiling begins to sway just slightly, not from any breeze strong enough to name, but from the lingering push of earlier warmth rising and retreating, the subtle breaths of temperature shifting as night prepares for dawn. And the fan, woven long ago from river reeds by the woman's uncle, its strands dry and light and tied together in a loose palm leaf pattern, does not swing or spin or flutter dramatically, but rocks so gently from side to side that it might be mistaken for stillness, were it not for the way the shadows it casts on the clay wall also move, lengthening and shortening in slow rhythm like a heartbeat you can only feel through silence. And the fan has always been there, hung when the woman was just a girl, perhaps even before that, installed with no ceremony, tied with a single strip of leather through a notch carved into the beam, and it has never been replaced, only dusted, occasionally with a cloth when the ceiling is swept. Yet it has watched every season pass within this house, has danced slightly in the heat of summer when the air grew thick and the floor too warm to sit upon, has turned more slowly during the winter nights when firelight flickered beneath it, casting long oval shadows like floating lanterns, has listened to the cries of infants and the hum of lullabies, to the crackle of bread crusts breaking open and the drip of soup ladles tapped against clay. And now in the middle of this long night, when no voices rise and no footsteps cross the threshold, the fan continues its subtle motion, moved by nothing more than the fading breath of heat escaping the earth. And though no one is awake to see it, it moves with the grace of something ancient and patient, something shaped not for display but for continuity. And the woman, still deeply asleep on her mat, stirs faintly in response, not in reaction to the fan's motion itself, but to the sense of movement it brings to the room, as if the night were gently brushing the air with invisible fingers, keeping the space from becoming too still, too heavy, too final. And her son, curled beside her in his usual sleeping position, does not move, but the fan's presence hovers above him too, part of the air he breathes, the coolness he feels against his cheek, the soft whisper that trails across the mat without a sound. And in her dreams, perhaps without knowing the source, the woman envisions a field of reeds swaying under moonlight, the long grass bowing to a wind that cannot be seen, the rhythm of the earth bending but never breaking, and this dream comforts her, fills her with a sense of belonging to something larger than herself. A world where motion and stillness exist together, where even sleep carries movement, where even the most ordinary thing, like a reed fan hanging from a wooden beam, becomes part of a story told not in words but in gestures and breath. And as the fan continues to sway, its threads sighing into their curve and back again, the room remains at peace. The house holding its sleepers like a bowl holds water, and the IGG night, though nearly spent, offers this final dance of shadow and reed and rhythm before the first light of day begins to rise. As the deep silence of night begins its slow retreat before the faint pressure of coming dawn, when the stars still hang quietly above the sleeping rooftops, but the edges of the darkness begin to loosen like thread unraveling from a woven shawl, there comes so faintly that it might at first be mistaken for imagination or the soft stretch of a dream, the sound of a distant pottery cart creaking along the worn stone path that curves through the lower quarter of the city, its wheels heavy. With clay vessels wrapped in straw, its slow rhythm echoing through the alleys like a forgotten lullaby whispered into the bones of the buildings. And this sound, carried through the narrow spaces between homes and over the reed roofs that line the sky like woven maps, reaches the walls of the woman's house with a softness that masks the weight of the cart itself, a sound more felt than heard, low and regular, like the heartbeat of labor in a city that never fully sleeps. And though the woman lies on her, mat with eyes closed and limbs stilled by the warmth of blankets and the hush of familiar darkness, something in her body stirs at the sound, not with movement but with memory, as if part of her remembers mornings when she was younger and would wake to the same creak of wheels and the dull thud of pots being shifted carefully against each other, adjusting her shoulder closer to the wall, and as she exhales, her breath, though invisible, joins all the other breaths the room has ever known, carried lightly across the clay, absorbed into its pores, and outside the night remains still. But something begins to stir in the air, a faint brightness slowly beginning its journey from the horizon. Not yet light, but the suggestion of light, the hush before a new color is born. And inside, the walls hold everything in place, the child's quiet breathing, the warmth of bodies sleeping close, the thin woven rug under the mat, the basket of folded clothes near the corner, and the faded marks, barely distinguishable from the clay around them, remain unchanged, unchanged by sleep or story, unchanged by time's passing footsteps, waiting not for recognition but for continuation, for the next hand to brush past, the next voice to echo softly nearby, the next moment to become a memory, pressed gently into the wall like a whispered breath into stone. In the farthest corner of the home, just beyond where the fire's warmth would have reached earlier in the evening, tucked neatly beside a low shelf built into the wall from the same sun-baked clay that makes up the rest of the house, there rests a squat rounded jar, its surface rough with age, its lid slightly ajar, as though someone meant to return for it but never quite did. And within this unremarkable vessel, beneath a woven cover of palm fibers that had once been tied snug but has since loosened with time, there lies the last of the dried dates harvested during the final stretch of the last season. Small, shriveled pieces of sweetness now hardened. With age their skins wrinkled like ancient fingers, and their once sticky surfaces now dulled by dust and quiet. And though the jar is not large and the dates are few, it holds within its silent, shaded space a kind of weight that goes far, beyond its content. For it is not just a storage container, but a symbol of preservation, of care, of the way each household in Babylon must stretch its harvest across months, marking the shift from plenty to patience, from abundance to endurance. And in this home, as the woman and her son sleep peacefully on their mat, the jar keeps its quiet vigil, a reminder of sweetness remembered, of careful hands and forward planning, and in her dreams, though she does not know she is dreaming, the woman walks barefoot through a grove of date palms, the light low and golden, her arms stretched with a basket as she reaches for the lowest branches, and she feels the heat of the sun against her forearm, the sticky weight of the fresh fruit as it lands in her palm, the buzzing of flies somewhere near the roots. And though she does not speak, a feeling of contentment floods the scene. And in the dream she remembers sorting the dates, laying them in shallow trays, watching as they darken and shrink beneath the sun, and she recalls how later she packed them carefully into this same jar, pressing each handful gently but firmly, layer by layer, sealing in the scent of summer, for use in the colder moons. And now as she sleeps, the jar remains where she placed it, unbothered, half hidden in the low light of night, but still quietly offering its presence, a sealed memory of a season that once was, a taste of warmth preserved through cold. And her son, though too young to remember the harvest, knows the jar as the place where small treasures come from. A single date, given when the day has been difficult, a reward for sweeping the floor without complaint, a gift tucked into his palm when he cried without reason. And though tonight the jar is untouched, and will remain untouched until morning or longer, it continues to speak in the language of stored sweetness, a language the house understands well. And the air near it is faintly different, touched with a scent of old fruit and earth and woven lid, and if one leaned close, they might hear the faintest crackle of the dry stems shifting within. And outside the stars begin their slow descent, and a pale silver light begins to press faintly at the sky's edge. But inside the home, the clay jar and its hidden gift of dried dates continues to rest in stillness, a small solid thing amid the softness of shadow and breath, a token of sweetness that waits without urgency, content in its place, secure in the rhythm of time, of fruit gathered and remembered, of hunger answered not in haste but in patience, as the final hour before dawn stretches itself across the slumbering city, with the quiet sky still cloaked in starlight and the rooftops resting beneath the weight of silence. The smallest details of the home begin to take on their own quiet meaning, and among these unnoticed fragments of life, there is a single thread, pale fine, almost invisible in the low light, caught delicately on the edge of a woven basket that hangs from a peg near the entrance to the sleeping room, its presence so minor, so incidental, that no waking eye would likely pause to observe it. And yet in the calm stillness of this moment, when all things rest and no footsteps echo through the passageways, the thread exists like a whispered story, caught between breaths, a remnant of fabric or time or gesture that remains behind, holding still against the woven reed as if reluctant to leave. And this thread, likely loosened from the hem of a tunic or brushed off a blanket or a head covering, now rests as a single curved line of fibre, its edge trembling ever so slightly as the softest breath of air passes through the room, and though no one is awake to see it, and it serves no purpose of function or design. Its presence carries with it the entire memory of the cloth it came from, of the hands that wove that cloth, of the motion of fingers threading and knotting and pressing down tightly to form the pattern from which the fabric was born. And so the woman, lying in peaceful sleep not far from where the basket hangs, remains unaware of the thread's small journey. But perhaps in her dreams she is again seated beside her mother, the two of them bent over a loom in the courtyard's shadow, the older hands showing the younger how to twist the fibers just so, how to anchor the tension without snapping the strands, how to feel the shift in the air when the cloth begins to form its own rhythm. And though she does not dream with clarity, the feeling remains, the tactile calm of repetition, the comfort of shared labor, the sense of time not measured in hours but in completed lines and woven rows. And so now, as she sleeps, the thread remains caught, quiet and patient, clinging gently to the basket's rim, which itself once carried fresh barley and folded garments and sun-dried fish wrapped in linen. And though it is empty now, its purpose fulfilled and waiting for the next use, the presence of the thread gives it a new kind of weight, a detail, so small that it could be overlooked forever, and yet it lingers, held by nothing more than friction and stillness, a symbol of how nothing is ever truly lost, only changed, only paused. And as the room darkens just slightly before light begins to rise in earnest, the thread remains untouched, unmoved by time or intention, and in this moment it becomes part of the room's memory, part of the woven silence, a detail that echoes the quiet truth of the home itself, that the smallest things, the thread, the corner of a mat, the cool press of clay beneath a sleeping palm, are what hold the greatest tenderness, what preserve the ordinary beauty of days that passed without ceremony. And while the woman and her son continue to sleep, the thread remains, trembling faintly in the breath of air that comes before sunrise, still tethered to its basket, still telling its silent story to the shadowed wall behind it. As the hush of the house deepens into that strange and sacred stillness, just before light begins to spill into the sky, when all breathing seems aligned, and the boundaries between dream and waking begin to stretch thin like softened wax, a small, Almost invisible presence rests beneath the low shelf built into the far wall. A simple wooden spoon, its surface smooth and darkened with use, its handle slightly chipped at the end, lying still on its side, half in shadow and half beneath the faded edge of a fallen linen cloth. And this spoon, which might have once been used to stir lentil, stew over the hearth or to scrape the last bit of thick date syrup from a clay bowl, now lies quietly, not broken or discarded, simply forgotten, its usefulness temporarily paused in a moment that turned to days, then weeks, and now it rests like a sleeper itself, tucked beneath the structure that once held it, shaped by hands now stilled in sleep nearby, and though it has not moved in some time, it bears on its surface the history of everything it has touched. The faint dark lines where heat once reached it too closely, the uneven curve of the bowl from where the carving knife dulled during shaping, the worn patch along the neck where the woman's thumb once pressed again and again while stirring, tasting, offering, cleaning. And now, as she lies curled, beneath her blanket, unaware of the spoon's current position, the memory of it somehow lingers within her, not consciously, not as a formed thought, but folded into her dreaming mind like the scent of broth or the sound of fire crackling. And in that space between sleep and memory, she recalls the feel of the spoon slipping through thick mixtures, of tapping its base against the lip of a jar, of holding it steady while feeding her son in his earliest days, his small hands reaching to mimic the motion, and the spoon, silent now and surrounded by dust motes that drift in the still air, becomes more than an object. It becomes a keeper of echoes, of everyday rituals performed without fanfare but with care, the kind of gestures that build homes not with architecture, but with repetition and intention, and though no one will reach for it tonight and perhaps not tomorrow, it waits without expectation, its presence adding to the balance of the space, the continuity of things used, things kept, things remembered, even when they are not seen, and the room, deep in its slumber, seems to hold the spoon in its breath, the way a forest holds a fallen leaf, not grieving, not forgetting, but absorbing. And outside, the stars begin to soften, washed with the earliest tones of blue that whisper of morning to come. And inside, the woman sighs gently in her sleep, her face pressed against the mat, her arm shifting slightly under the wool, and in the motionless space beneath the shelf, the spoon lies undisturbed, whole, waiting, not just for use, but for time to pass around it, for the day when it will again be part of something simple and quiet, a stirred pot, a shared meal, a moment too small to mark and yet too human to ever truly vanish. In the softest chamber of night, just before the sky begins its subtle transition from ink to ash, when the whole house seems suspended in a state of suspended thought, there lies beneath the sleeping forms of the woman and her son a large woven mat, handcrafted from strips of date palm leaves gathered seasons ago, its edges slightly curled from time, its surface lined with the gentle imperfections that mark it as handmade, its every strand pulled and braided in a pattern so familiar that no one notices it anymore, and yet so essential that the home would feel incomplete without it. This mat, neither new nor worn to uselessness, rests quietly under the weight of sleep, its interlocking geometry holding steady as if it too breathes along with the sleepers above it, as if the memory of the hands that made it still lingers in each crease and curve, and though it lies hidden now beneath a blanket, beneath the soft fabric of nightclothes, beneath the curled warmth of limbs in repose, the mat remembers everything it has cradled, the restless shifting of a child sick with fever, the long sighs of a woman lying awake while the fire faded, the crumbs of dried barley that fell after a rushed evening meal, the silent press of knees during prayer, the rhythms of weaving, rocking, sitting, folding, and in this moment as the house sleeps, the mat becomes a silent witness to presence itself, the unspeaking foundation of life's smaller moments, the kind of thing that receives everything and demands nothing, and the pattern woven into it, a repetition of overlapping diamonds and narrow bands, serves not as decoration, but as a quiet architecture, the kind of design that reveals itself only to those who pause long enough to trace its rhythm with their fingers, the kind of design that teaches patience and repetition and respect for subtlety. And in her dreams, the woman might see flashes, of those hands that once bent over the half-formed mat under the shade of a cloth awning in late afternoon, braiding palm strips through blistered fingers, humming softly in time with the pull and press, stopping only to swat flies or sip from a clay cup, and she might feel, deep within the unspoken part of herself, the sense of safety that comes from sleeping on something shaped by care, something that does not complain or shift or break, but remains, year after year, to carry the weight of daily living. And now, while the night still holds its breath, and the wind has not yet stirred, the mat lies beneath them like a memory pressed into place, offering a stable peace to the room, its scent faintly earthy, its edges soft with dust, its surface still warm from the day's heat, and outside, the windowless wall. Beyond the reach of lamps and stars, the city begins to inhale, but inside, within these clay confines, the mat continues to serve in silence, grounding the sleeping bodies not only to the earth, but to history, to habit, to the woven logic of time itself, a single quiet rectangle of purpose beneath a life lived in whispers, one night at a time. Beyond the clay walls of the home, where the soft curve of baked mud meets the cool edge of the night air, the city of Babylon lies sprawled in slumber, its broad lanes and narrow alleys veiled beneath the same hush that blankets the sleeping. Room, though on a scale far larger and older, as if the city itself were a breathing being, paused in thought beneath the gaze of the stars, and its rooftops, flat and low, and laid in uneven lines, stretch out across the darkness like pages in a half-remembered dream, their shadows overlapping like folds in fabric, where every edge marks a doorway, every corner a whispered life. And while the woman and her son lie in peaceful rest within the safety of their quiet room, the entire city beyond holds its breath in parallel rhythm, every home tucked into silence, every courtyard asleep beneath, the blackened sky, every cistern still, its water cold and reflective, disturbed only by the occasional drip from a clay spout. And if one were to walk the streets now, barefoot and slow, they would hear not the chaos of market, or the call of merchants, or the clatter of carts, but instead the layered quiet of a living place gone momentarily still, the creak of a beam settling beneath its own weight, the whisper of sand shifting against a doorframe, the faint shuffle of a stray cat moving like a shadow through the space between homes. And this stillness is not emptiness, but fullness paused, the kind of quiet that follows deep labor, a rest earned by thousands of hands that shaped this place into what it is, and somewhere near the ziggurat, where the sky above opens wider and the moonlight pools more boldly, even the priests' torches have long since burned out, their tall reeds still standing but dim, while inside temples and workshops alike, tools lie untouched, sleeping alongside their owners, and even the clay scribes' tablets stacked in rows now gather a fine coat of dust as if to honor the hours of rest. And this entire city, though vast and ancient, seems to shrink in upon itself during the night, curling inward like a body, against cold, every building drawing close to the next, every sound softened by the weight of dreams. And from the vantage point of the woman's small home, the city exists only as suggestion, the faint smell of smoke that drifts in from another quarter, the dull gleam of a copper roof touched by moonlight, the occasional murmur of footsteps far beyond the threshold. And in her dreams, though she does not know it, the woman walks briefly through this silent city, her feet brushing dust from worn bricks, her hand trailing along walls she knows by heart, passing doors that hold stories she has heard since childhood. And though she meets no one and says nothing, the walk fills her with a sense of belonging so deep it requires no explanation. And back in the room, her son sighs softly in sleep, shifting his weight, while the city beyond remains unchanged, wrapped in its ancient stillness, not frozen but waiting, not lost but held, like a vast breath taken in and not yet exhaled. And so, while the night continues and the sky overhead begins, ever so faintly, to soften at its highest edge, the home and the city remain in quiet harmony, bound together by silence, by walls and walkways, by dreams that stretch from the smallest room to the farthest rooftop, echoing gently in the spaces between stars. Near the threshold of the sleeping room, just beside the curved entryway where the wall dips slightly inward to allow for movement without a door, there rests a small object often unnoticed by those who live within the home. A clay seal pressed carefully against the base of the wall, partially obscured by a drift of fine dust and a layer of everyday stillness. And though it appears now as little more than a rounded lump of dried earth, its surface faintly ridged and its edges worn smooth with time, it holds within its humble shape a history of intention, of marking and naming and quiet authority. For this seal, made by the woman's husband long ago, before his journeys took him elsewhere, and before silence became more familiar than his voice, was once pressed into damp clay tablets to signify agreement, to formalize the trade of oil for grain or the transfer of ownership from one roof to another. Its pattern, a simple weave of crisscrossed lines and a half-circle meant to represent the moon's favor, unique to his hand and known by those in the market as a symbol of dependability, and now, though it is no longer used, no longer carried to the merchant's quarter or dipped into soft clay, it remains here just beside the entryway, tucked into the home like a word unspoken but still understood. And in her sleep, the woman does not dream of the seal directly, but something about its presence enters her dream like a current beneath still water, a sense of shape and permanence, a reminder of the countless times she watched him roll it between his fingers, his thumb resting gently on its surface as he negotiated, as he measured, as he paused in thought. And perhaps in her dream, she sits beside him again, not speaking, just watching the way his hand moves, the way he places the seal carefully into a cloth pouch, tying it with a strand of flax as if it was something sacred. And even now, years later, she has not moved it from its place, not because she expects his return, but because to move it would be to unmake something quiet and foundational, something that belongs not only to memory, but to the structure of the room itself and the seal. Though small, seems to hum with the weight of its use, not loud or magical, but steady like the beat of a drum that has long since stopped sounding, but still marks the tempo of life around it. And beside it, the wall bears a faint indentation, worn by the sweep of robes passing through the doorway day after day, year after year, and the floor beneath it has smoothed from bare feet, stepping close and then turning away. And even the light that falls through the morning cracks seems to touch the seal gently, as though acknowledging its place. And outside, the sky continues to brighten in the barest increments, a faint breath of grey softening the far horizon. But inside the room, the seal remains unmoved, untouched, serving no function, and yet embodying the rhythm of order, of household, of decisions made in shadow and sunlight. And as the woman breathes slowly in her sleep, her son's fingers twitching slightly as he drifts deeper into his dreams, the seal keeps its silent place, a symbol of all that has been agreed to without words, a quiet mark at the edge of the home, anchoring everything it once touched with the still power of memory. As the final veil of night begins to thin ever so gently at the horizon, and the stars, once vivid and confident, slowly dim into the pale fabric of approaching dawn, a single narrow sliver of morning light makes its quiet entrance into the house, not with ceremony or blaze, but with the soft certainty of something inevitable, slipping first through the highest edge of the courtyard opening, where the woven awning hangs loosely, and the bricks bear a permanent warmth from long-ago suns, and then spilling onto the floor in a golden line so thin and so precise that it appears more imagined than real, a breath of light rather than a beam, a subtle announcement that time continues, that the day has returned as it always does, slow and unhurried, pushing gently against the night without urgency. And this small line of light stretches slowly across the hard-packed clay floor, following the shape of the walls and the angle of the sun beyond, its lengthening path brushing against the edge of a basket, then across a corner of the mat, before finally landing in a soft pool near the stack of folded cloths, resting quietly on a low shelf. And though no one in the house is awake to greet it, the light enters with complete familiarity, as though the home itself remembers this ritual, as though every surface knows its timing and position by heart, each crack in the floor, each line in the mud brick, waiting for that moment of gentle illumination. And within her sleep, the woman stirs ever so slightly, though her eyes remain closed and her body still heavy with rest, as if the change in the air, the warmth on her cheek, The soft shift in light is enough to move her deeper into her dream rather than lift her out of it. And in that dream, she may be back in a sunlit courtyard, sweeping the dust with a palm broom, watching the same beam of light stretch slowly toward her as the hours pass. Her hands moving with rhythm but no haste, her body tracing the same path as the sun, hour after hour, year after year, and outside, beyond the roofline, the city begins its barely audible waking. The soft thump of a distant shutter being nudged open, the scuff of a dog's paws against dry stone, the first faint splash of water being drawn from a well. But inside, the home remains wrapped in quiet, the light not yet strong enough to break the spell of night, only to announce its end, the way a whisper can end a silence without shattering it. And the sun, still curled in the blanket's fold, sleeps with one hand tucked beneath his cheek, his breath even and warm, untouched by the shifting glow that now touches the mat beside him. And the light, growing inch by inch, moment by moment, continues its silent journey across the room, softening edges, warming surfaces, calling nothing by name but touching everything in turn. And as it falls on the edge of the woman's foot, still beneath her blanket, it becomes not just the start of a new day but the continuation of countless days like it, ordinary, unmarked, slow and sacred, where the same light returns to the same home in the same way, not to awaken, not to command, but to simply be present, to affirm that the world still turns, that breath still flows, that even the most silent hours must open, gently and fully, into the life that waits on the other side of sleep. Just beyond the sleeping room, nestled within the curve of a shallow alcove carved into the clay wall, where the shade holds longest, even after the sun begins its slow return, there stands a tall water jar made of unglazed ceramic, its surface textured like stone shaped by wind, cool to the touch and faintly damp from the condensation that gathers each night as the air grows colder. And in the dim quiet of early dawn, before any voices rise or feet touch the floor, the jar becomes the silent keeper of one of the home's most essential comforts, the first sip of water after sleep, the small yet sacred return of moisture to lips that have rested in silence, the slow reawakening of the body through this one ancient and wordless act. And though no one has yet risen to approach it, and the house remains wrapped in stillness, the jar waits with perfect patience, its narrow mouth covered with a circular piece of woven reed to keep out dust and insects, its neck wrapped with a strip of cloth slightly darker from years of handling, and within it the water rests, still, unshaken, collected the day before from the public well, filtered through layers of sand and stone, poured gently from a wide-lipped pitcher until it was full, then left untouched through the night while the household slept. And now, as the air around it begins to shift from night's heavy cool to morning's lighter freshness, the jar holds not just water but calm, as if it absorbs the peace of the hours in which no hands disturbed it, holding within its curved belly the memory of quiet, the cool echo of night. And in her sleep, the woman, still curled upon the mat, dreams of the feel of the jar's rim against her palm, the sudden chill of water against her tongue, the small relief that follows after dryness, not dramatic or cinematic, but deeply human, deeply necessary. And perhaps in her dream she carries the jar again, walking slowly through the courtyard, with it balanced against her hip, listening to the soft slosh of its contents as she moves, the sound gentle and full like breath in the lungs of the earth. And though the jar is heavy, she handles it with the ease of repetition, her arms familiar with the curve, her fingers knowing instinctively where to hold, where to support, how to tip without spilling. And now, though she sleeps, the jar waits, and its presence fills the home with a kind of steady reassurance, a vessel not only of liquid, but of order and rhythm and continuity. And outside, the faint rustle of morning begins to gather, a breeze nudging the edge of the reed mat hanging near the entrance, a bird beginning to chirp somewhere atop a nearby wall, a far-off voice coughing awake. But inside, the jar continues to rest in its shade-drenched corner, a pillar of stillness, its contents unchanged, its task not urgent but inevitable. For soon, not yet but soon, a hand will reach for it, lift the lid, pour a small clay cup, and in that first sip, the home will awaken not with noise but with quiet hydration. with the return of balance, with the cooling clarity of something essential. And so, while the light expands slowly across the clay floor, the jar remains, in waiting as it has every morning before, not aware of time but shaped entirely by it, a guardian of thirst, of ritual, of the gentle beginning of each new day. In the quiet transition from night to morning, when the weight of sleep still presses gently on the room like a second roof made of silence, and the breath of each sleeper remains steady and slow, there lies at the edge of the mat a wool blanket, thick in some places, thinned in others, its fibers softened by time and its edges beginning to come undone in slow, delicate strands. And this blanket, once part of a wedding dowry, died years ago with crushed roots and river clay to give it its faded brownish-red hue, now serves not only to warm but to comfort in its familiarity, in its scent, in the way it folds so naturally around the body without resistance. And in this early hour, with no movement yet stirring from the mother or the child, the blanket rests half-folded across the mat, one corner stretched toward the woven basket. Nearby another edge bunched up gently near the child's knees, where his small legs have shifted in sleep. And in this position, the unraveling becomes visible, just a few loose threads pulling away from the rest, curling softly like tendrils of hair, light enough that even the faintest breeze from the courtyard could move them. But no such breeze comes yet, and so the threads remain where they are, suspended in quiet, the way a thought lingers at the back of the mind, and the woman, still caught in the tail end of her slumber, does not see the threads, but somewhere within her dreaming self there exists the vague awareness of the blanket's softness, of its comforting weight, of the many mornings she has awoken beneath it and drawn it closer before rising. And in those moments, whether remembered or not, the blanket has always offered more than warmth. It has offered continuity, a sense that something holds even when everything else shifts. And perhaps long ago she sat with her mother and grandmother on the roof during the cooler months, helping unravel and reweave one of the older blankets, their hands working together while the light faded, their conversation slow, filled with long pauses and gentle laughter, the kind of labor that doesn't feel like labor at all, but like belonging. And now this blanket, so much a part of her life that she rarely considers it consciously, continues its quiet work, not by shielding against cold now, for the night has not been bitter, but by providing the kind of comfort that cannot be named, only felt, and the unraveling at the edge, while subtle, marks the passage of time in a way that is neither sad nor troubling, but simply natural, the way all things that are used and loved begin to fray, and though eventually the thread will grow longer, perhaps requiring a stitch or a knot to hold it in place, for now it remains as it is, an elegant reminder that nothing remains unchanged, and that change, when it comes slowly, becomes part of beauty rather than its undoing. And outside the home, the city prepares to awaken, still, hesitating at the brink of dawn, while inside, the blanket and its gentle unraveling continue their silent presence, resting beneath the bodies they serve, bearing no burden heavier than sleep itself, and offering, as they always have, the quiet promise that warmth and rest are things that endure, even as the threads begin to loosen. As the faintest layers of morning light stretch themselves cautiously over the rooftops of the still sleeping city, and the sky begins to shift from its star-drenched darkness into the cool gray of pre-dawn, a subtle change creeps into the air. Within the clay-walled home, not sharp or sudden, but soft and familiar, like the turning of a page in a book that has been read countless times, and that change is the scent of burnt ash, the quiet reminder of the fire that once glowed gently in the small clay hearth tucked in the corner of the courtyard, now, long since extinguished, reduced to a circle of warm dust and faintly glowing embers, hidden beneath a blanket of charred wood and blackened husks. And the smell, faint and earthy, mingled with the scent of soot and the coolness of early morning, slips inward through the open passage, curling like a memory into the edges of the sleeping room, where the woman and her son still lie tucked beneath their woven blankets, unaware yet gently surrounded by the scent that speaks of yesterday's warmth, of food shared, of light carefully tended, and the hearth itself, now no longer needed for the night, remains undisturbed, its presence more symbolic than practical at this hour, a reminder of the work done long before sleep took hold, and in her dreams the woman might be squatting again beside it, carefully arranging pieces of split wood and dry reeds in a small pyramid, her fingers moving automatically, brushing ash from the rim, striking flint against stone until the faintest spark catches, nursing the flame with steady breath, the early, smoke curling upward into the open air. And even though her hands are not doing this now, the scent pulls her gently toward that memory, that rhythm of preparation and care, the long habit of rising before light and building heat, not just for cooking but to soften the day ahead. And though the fire has cooled, its remnants remain vital. The trace heat in the clay nearby, the dull red of half-buried embers that will need only a breath and a twig to reignite, the scent that now infuses the house with a quiet, grounding presence. And this scent, familiar and constant, joins the many layers of the household atmosphere. The musky warmth of wool blankets, the dry smell of straw mats, the sharper edge of sun-dried herbs stored near the wall. And the boy, though still asleep, stirs slightly at the change, his small nose twitching as he inhales, his body turning inward, as if drawn deeper into dreams by the comfort of a smell that means safety, routine, home. And the woman's breath deepens, too, her brow relaxing, as if her body, without waking, recognizes the sequence of morning before it has properly begun. And outside, a neighboring home lets out its first sound, the creak of a wooden door lifted from its night latch, the distant murmur of someone calling quietly to another. But within this home, the smell of ash continues to linger, to settle into the corners, to curl along the edges of baskets and pots, and to serve without flame or light, as the first sign that the new day is drawing near, that warmth has come before and will come again, that life unfolds most steadily through these gentle, ordinary transitions. And so the scent lingers, neither urgent nor fading, but perfectly timed, like a breath between dreams, like the closing hush of night before the full weight of day is allowed to arrive. In the soft, nearly silent hour just before the sun climbs fully into view, as the light within the clay house hovers between dusk's shadow and daybreak's promise, there sits on a low shelf in the corner of the room a ceramic bowl, shallow, wide-rimmed, glazed only on the inside, with a hairline crack stretching across one edge, like a delicate scar that has long since healed. And though empty now, having been cleaned carefully after its last use and placed upside down to keep out dust, the bowl seems to hum faintly with the memory of sounds it once held, the soft scrape of wooden spoons, the rhythmic thud of lentils poured into it from a woven bag, the gentle slosh of broth or water during quiet meals. And in this hour, where everything rests but nothing feels abandoned, the bowl becomes more than a vessel. It becomes an echo chamber, a space where routine continues to live not in action but in presence, the way a song might linger after the singer has left the room, and the woman, still lying on the mat with her body curled and her arms tucked, close to her chest, does not open her eyes, but somewhere in the drifting tide of sleep, her mind brushes against the image of the bowl, and she remembers not one specific moment, but a dozen layered together. Her mother rinsing herbs in it while the wind played with the curtain, her own hands cupping water from it to press against her child's feverish brow, her late husband stirring porridge with a sleepy smile as the boy clapped on the floor nearby. And none of these memories come clearly or sequentially, but rather like waves moving across the surface of a quiet lake, barely touching the shore before slipping back into the deeper water. And the bowl, unchanged in shape or purpose, holds all of this invisibly within its curved walls, its glaze still slightly chipped near the rim where it once fell from a shelf and was caught just in time. And around it, the other items on the shelf remain, still, a folded cloth used to dry hands, a small jar of powdered spices sealed with wax, a coil of reed string used to tie rolled mats. And yet it is the bowl that draws the soft light, reflecting the slow golden hue of the rising sun against its curve, making it appear just for a moment as if it glows, not from fire, not from magic, but from its own memory of being useful, of holding nourishment, of resting at the center of a home's most mundane yet sacred acts. And though no one will touch it for some time yet, and it may sit in stillness all through the morning, Its presence continues to resonate in the way that only well-used things do, with a kind of silent testimony that says, "I have been part of your life. I have carried what you've needed. I have waited, and I will wait again." And so the bowl remains, casting a slight shadow on the shelf's surface, while the woman dreams faintly of water and warmth and sound, while the boy sleeps with his hand now resting on the mat where crumbs once scattered, and while the house breathes slowly into the beginning of the day. And in this stillness, even the smallest object holds meaning, not by being noticed, but by simply enduring, by staying where it has always stayed, by offering the promise that the rhythm of life and of holding, of feeding, of cleaning, of pausing is as intact and steady as the bowl's quiet curve. In the warm hush of early morning, when the light has begun to slowly gather in corners, but has not yet spread its full glow across the center of the room, when the sounds of the outside world remain distant and muted, and the inside breathes, only with the slow rhythm of sleep, there clings to the upper wall of the home, just above the doorway's curve and nestled in the angle where wall meets ceiling, a small lizard, pale and flat against the clay, unmoving in a way so complete it seems more sculpture than creature, as though placed there by the hand of time itself rather than by choice or instinct, and its tiny limbs, splayed outward with the delicacy of dried petals, hold it in a fixed position that has not shifted since the cool of night settled in, while its narrow body seems to merge with the texture of the wall, colored in such a way that only the faintest flicker of an eyelid or the tiniest shift in breath reveals that it is, in fact, alive, and in this home where so little is wasted and even less is forgotten, the presence of the lizard is not unusual nor alarming, but rather expected, part of the background rhythm of the house, just like the grooved clay beneath one's feet or the faint lines in the woven mat. A silent guest that comes and goes as it pleases, leaving no trace and demanding nothing. And as it rests there, motionless, perhaps conserving warmth from the bricks that held the heat of yesterday's sun, it becomes an emblem of stillness itself, embodying the quiet the household clings to before the start of daily noise, and the woman, still deep in slumber, does not see the lizard, but her body remains stilled in the same suspended calm, her limbs resting gently as if in mirrored sympathy with the creature above, and perhaps in a forgotten thread of dream, she is once again sitting in the courtyard, brushing off the edge of a pot where a younger, quicker lizard darted beneath her fingers, and she smiled, not startled but amused. But, as her son leaned forward to try to see where it went, his hand pointing, his voice soft with wonder, and though that moment is long past, the lizard now on the wall belongs to the same lineage of household visits, of creatures that pass through, the edges of human life unnoticed except in quiet, and the air around it remains utterly still, undisturbed by wind or breath, and even the dust motes hang suspended in the shaft of early light that now begins to enter through the high wall. And if one were to stand beneath it and look upward, they might see not just the lizard's silhouette, but its small ribs expanding. With breath, its tiny toes gripping texture, its eyes alert even in sleep. And yet there is no tension, no readiness to flee, only acceptance, stillness, patience, as if the creature understands this room better than anyone, understands when to move and when to wait. And as the first distant clatter of pottery echoes from a nearby home, and the day prepares to step fully into its own light, the lizard remains where it is, peaceful and perfectly still. A silent, sentinel of a house not yet awake, part of a world that doesn't need to speak in order to belong. And down below, the mother and child continue to sleep, blanketed in quiet and watched over not by gods or ghosts, but by the unnoticed stillness of small living things that choose each morning simply to be present. In the softened light of morning, when the sun has not yet risen high enough to fill the room but has begun to cast its golden edge across the eastern courtyard wall, there rests upon the narrow, uneven ledge of the high window a fine layer of dust, so thin it might be mistaken for a shadow, so quiet it carries no weight but still commands a presence, settling there not with haste or noise, but with the slow patience of time itself, as though drawn by the earth's own steady breath. And this dust, gathered from days of still air and open sky, from particles of soil carried invisibly by wind that passed through distant alleyways and across rooftops and through market, Stalls now lies unmoving along the curve of clay that frames the window, a space not meant for watching, but for letting in air and light, its function practical and its presence nearly invisible until now, in this hour when shadows begin to shift and brightness peeks through in soft, hesitant streaks, and as the sun climbs inch by inch, a narrow blade of warm light enters the opening, striking the ledge and making the dust shimmer faintly, as if touched by memory itself, as if each grain contained a tiny echo of every place it had passed before arriving here. And in this house, where the pace of life is measured not in clocks but in gestures, in tasks that unfold in rhythm with the heat and the season, the dust is not a nuisance to be swept or scrubbed, away an annoyance but a companion, a quiet guest that reminds the inhabitants that the world moves even when they do not. And the woman, still sleeping on the mat with her face turned slightly toward that very wall, breathes in the subtle scent of earthen coolness that the dust carries, her body responding not with movement but with a deeper settling, as if the light itself is telling her it is not yet time to rise. And in the back of her mind, where dreams still linger in scattered fragments, she might feel the worn cloth she uses each week to clean the ledge, might remember how she folds it just so, how she moves her hand across the rim with practiced care, not rushing, not scrubbing, but simply encouraging the dust to leave, knowing full well it will return as it always does. And perhaps in that space between sleep and waking, she hears her mother's voice telling her long ago that to clean the dust is not to fight the earth, but to greet it, to welcome the return of what belongs to all spaces. And the ledge, warm now with morning's breath, holds this dust in quiet communion, without protest or pride, offering it back to the room like a secret, like a whispered story of everything that has passed unseen. And just beneath it the child shifts gently in his sleep, his fingers brushing the edge of the mat, while outside a bird calls once, then goes quiet again, as if unsure whether the world is truly awake. And the window, small and high, remains unchanged, a passageway for light, for wind, for the thin presence of dust that settles with such reverence, with such patience, asking for nothing, yet giving the room a sense of depth, a connection to the streets, to the soil, to the unseen movements of the day before. And in this house, where sleep still lingers, and time moves like water through cloth, the dust remains just a little longer, caught in morning's first light, unbothered, unhurried, part of the slow, endless story that even the smallest spaces quietly carry. Near the far corner of the sleeping room, not far from where the mat lies flat upon the floor, and just to the right of the alcove where shadows gather even after the sun has risen enough to warm the opposite wall, sits a modest wicker basket. Round and low, its sides bowed slightly outward from years of quiet use, woven tightly from split palm reeds that have darkened over time, and though it now holds almost nothing, just a length of frayed twine coiled like a resting insect and a single dull spindle of spun wool, its presence in the room is not diminished by its emptiness, for it remains, as it always has, a container not only of objects but of memory, of rhythm, of the small motions that once filled it with meaning. And the basket's weave, tight in some places and loose in others, tells a story of careful hands that bent and twisted the reeds while they were still green, fingers wet from the riverbank, arms tired from carrying, eyes focused not on beauty but on function, though the pattern they left behind is, in its own quiet way, beautiful, all the same. And as it rests now in the cool stillness of morning, touched only by the edge of shifting light that has begun to stretch across the floor like a slow breath, the basket offers no protest to its state of near emptiness, no shame in its idle posture, for it knows, if a basket can be said to know, that to wait is not to be wasted, that to be empty is simply to be ready again. And the woman, still asleep on the mat, might sense its shape nearby even without seeing it, for it has been part of her space for so long that her body has adjusted to its presence, the way one grows accustomed to a scar or a shadow. And in her dreams, if such quiet things can enter dreams, she might remember gathering wool scraps from beside the hearth and placing them into the basket one by one, or handing the basket to her son so he could carry water-smooth stones from the river, or hearing the gentle knock of the basket's base against the floor as she shifted it beside her feet while spinning thread on long, drowsy afternoons. And now, though it serves no task, The basket remains where it has always belonged, not removed or stored away, but left in place because the room would feel less whole without it, and its sides, though warped slightly from time and softened by sun, still cast faint shadows across the floor, shadows that change shape slowly as the sun rises, the way time presses its own fingerprints into things without asking permission. And the spindle, within smooth and unremarkable, still bears a faint curl of fibre wrapped near its middle, like the memory of work paused mid-motion and never resumed, though even in that pause there is no sorrow, only stillness. And in this home, where life unfolds not in grand declarations, but in the repetition of familiar acts, the basket's presence is as essential as any tool, as any spoken word, and outside, where the streets begin to warm and voices rise in low murmurs, this room still holds to its final moments of sleep, and the basket, resting in its corner, does not announce itself or demand attention. It simply exists, as all enduring things do, waiting with quiet purpose, bearing the history of use and the dignity of rest, a vessel not only for what is carried, but for the silence left behind. As the room remains swaddled in the last folds of early morning stillness, with the gentle gold of the sun inching slowly across the clay floor, like a soft hand reaching for familiar surfaces, there comes, from somewhere beyond the thick walls of the home and the shaded alley that hugs the building's outer edge, the faint and uneven sound of hooves striking against hardened earth, not close enough to alarm or stir the sleepers, but present all the same, like a heartbeat beneath. Layers of silence, and the hooves, 4 perhaps maybe 6, echo distantly as they move with the heavy rhythm of an animal, not galloping but walking, its pace deliberate, its body strong, carrying weight not of urgency, but of daily life, the kind of movement that repeats each morning and will repeat again tomorrow. And the sound arrives through the air in faint fragments, filtered through other courtyards and narrow spaces, bouncing softly off mud brick walls and worn stone thresholds, until it reaches the open window of the sleeping room as no more than a dull, rhythmic knock, like someone politely knocking on a memory instead of a door. And within the room the boy stirs slightly, his small hand curling near his chest, but he does not wake. And the woman, still wrapped in her blanket, remains unmoved, though somewhere within the deep quiet of her resting mind, the sound registers in that part of sleep where reality and dream blend, where an outside sound enters the story of slumber without needing to announce itself. And perhaps in her dream she is walking beside such a beast, perhaps an ox pulling a cart filled with reeds or sacks of grain, or perhaps a donkey with bundles of firewood tied to its sides, its ears flicking as it walks down the very path now echoed in sound. And the street itself, which runs a few homes beyond this one, is familiar to her. She has swept its edge with her own broom, stepped across its dusty width carrying jars, greeted neighbors there beneath the weak afternoon sun. And now, though she sleeps, her body still remembers the timing of such hooves, the slow and steady tempo that belongs more to the earth than to the animal. And the hooves pass slowly, not in a rush, and their rhythm fades gradually as the creature and its burden continue down the street, disappearing into the rest of the waking city. And though the sound is gone, it leaves behind a kind of residue in the room, a reminder that beyond these still walls, the world is beginning to move again, that commerce and labor and conversation are slowly lifting their heads and stretching their limbs, preparing to resume. But here inside, where the light has only now reached the edge of the mat, and the basket rests quietly in its corner, the house continues to hold itself in the last breath of night's peace. And the echo of hooves becomes part of that peace, not disturbing it but enriching it, adding depth to the silence, the way a low drumbeat makes a song feel fuller without drawing attention to itself. And so the sound, though gone, remains, tucked into the clay walls like the scent of last night's fire, like the shape of a blanket left crumpled after dreams. And in this home, where time does not sprint but seeps, even something as fleeting as distant hooves can leave a gentle trace, a soft reminder that everything is connected by sound, by dust, by rhythm, by the quiet movement of life continuing just outside the frame of sleep. At the very back of the house, beyond the main sleeping area and the central living space, past the courtyard where light begins to fall more confidently now as the morning unfolds its pale gold across mud brick and mat. There lies a small, narrow room once meant for storage, where shadows are slower to lift and silence sits thicker. A room rarely visited in the earliest hours, yet known to everyone in the household as a space that simply is, useful, familiar, unspoken. And in this room, whose floor is lined with pressed clay and whose air smells faintly of straw and dried grain, there is a single, sloping crack in the far corner of the rear wall, running like a long, thin line drawn by a trembling hand from ceiling to floor, barely wide enough to press a fingernail into, yet present in such a way that it anchors the space, a quiet marker of time and change and stillness enduring despite both. And though no one remembers exactly when it first appeared, the woman has long accepted it, her eyes passing over it without concern each time she steps into the room to gather dried legumes, to collect a jar of sesame oil, or to fold and stack unused baskets along the floor. For in a house made from earth and straw and water, cracks are not signs of danger but of living, of breathing walls that shift with the seasons, with the heat and the rain and the long, slow settling of the world around them. And this particular crack, touched occasionally by fingertips or the tail ends of cloths, and even once by the curious hand of the child who wondered aloud whether something lived inside it, remains unchanged, unmoving, a line that seems not to threaten but to belong, like a wrinkle on a familiar face. And now in the stillness of morning before footsteps disturb the packed dirt, the crack rests in the shade of the narrow room, its depth unreadable, its shape made softer by the dust that clings to its edges, and the single cobweb stretched lazily across its upper third, delicate as a breath and shimmering faintly in the stray beam of light that reaches in through a narrow slit near the ceiling. And outside the room life begins to stir. A broom brushes faintly along a neighbor's walkway, a pot clinks softly as it's moved on a ledge. A low voice hums a tuneless song not meant for anyone in particular, but inside. The storage room holds its calm, and the crack, like the rest of the room, does not respond or shift or speak. It simply exists. And in its silence is the story of time's patient craftsmanship, a reminder that even stillness changes. Even the most forgotten corners are touched by the passing of days. And perhaps, much later, when the sun is higher and the work of the home has begun, the woman will enter once again, stepping lightly across the floor, pausing only briefly to glance at the familiar corner, not with worry or thought, but with the quiet recognition of something that belongs to her life in a way that is deeper than memory. And for now, the crack remains alone with the dust and the shadow and the quiet, a line not of failure but of presence, a sign that this house, like all homes, is not static but settling, not perfect but lived in. And in that imperfect settling is a peace so complete that even the smallest fracture can feel like something sacred, resting in the outer corner of the courtyard, where the sun does not yet fully reach, and where a shallow shadow lingers against the base of the wall like a pool of breath held from the night before, lies a small, bundled cluster of dried reeds, smooth hollow stalks gathered from the riverbank weeks earlier and tied carefully together with a length of faded blue string, knotted once at the middle and then again lower toward the base, the string itself frayed and worn from use, its original brightness softened to the color of aged sky. And this bundle, which might seem to the casual eye like refuse or kindling, is anything but forgotten, for it has been placed there with quiet intention, leaning gently at an angle that allows the thicker ends to rest against the wall, while the narrow tips fan out just slightly toward the open space of the yard. And though it serves no immediate purpose this morning, it has served many before and will again, woven into mats, split for fire starters, twisted into cords, even used to reinforce the tops of small baskets or the seams of drafty doorways, and its presence in the courtyard, exposed to the dust, and air and shifting light, feels as natural and permanent as the pot stacked beneath the awning or the mat rolled tightly against the wall. And if one were to crouch beside it and run their fingers along the stems, they would feel the ridges of growth, the smoothness that speaks of water and sun and wind, the slight give beneath pressure that signals the reed's continued usefulness. And though the woman is still inside, still resting with her eyes gently closed and her body curled in quiet warmth, there is a part of her mind that knows the reeds are there, That remembers gathering them with her son just outside the city, where the marsh meets the river and the air hums with insects, and reeds grow thick as a wall, and she might remember, even in sleep, how she bent to cut them low, to the ground while her son chased frogs nearby, calling out to her with delight as she laughed and shook her head, hands sticky from sap and sun. And the blue string, tied as she always ties it, a double knot she learned from her own mother, holds the reeds now as tightly as it did then, unchanged except for a few loose threads where the fibers have begun to separate, the color dulled by dust, but still enough to stand out in a courtyard filled mostly with tones of earth and clay. And in the rising warmth of day, the bundle will cast a thin, slanted shadow that shifts slowly across the floor, stretching as the sun rises, shrinking as the light reaches overhead, marking the passage of time not with noise or bells, but with lengthening and shortening shade. And though no one touches it yet, and it may sit untouched all day, the bundle waits, as all useful things do, not with urgency, but with certainty, knowing its time will come again. And within, its hollow shafts, tiny grains of river silt still cling, the scent of wet soil faint if one leans close enough to inhale, and in that scent is the memory of another place, another light, another rhythm folded neatly into the life of this home. And so the bundle of reeds tied with its simple string becomes more than just a collection of stems. It becomes a symbol of preparation, of continuity, of care past, from one generation to another. And in this quiet hour before feet cross the courtyard or water is drawn from the jar, it remains exactly as it should be, waiting in the stillness, not forgotten, but trusted to wait. Resting on the worn wooden board near the hearth, nestled among a few scattered grains of dry seed husk and a small fold of linen cloth used to wipe the dust from its surface, lies a flat, palm-sized stone, oval in shape, smooth as bone, its surface marked faintly by years of use, not chipped or broken, but polished by repetition, darkened in the center where countless pinches of herbs, salt crystals, dried roots and fragrant flowers have been pressed against it, ground into paste or powder, stirred into mixtures meant to flavor soups or soothe coughs or offer fragrance to oil. And though no one in the house is yet awake to touch it, to lift it with a knowing hand and match it to its heavier grinding base, the stone lies still, in its place, not misplaced, not forgotten, but waiting with the patient silence of a thing that knows its purpose and trusts the rhythm of returning need. And this stone, which may once have been pulled from the banks of a river and turned over in a curious child's hand before it was repurposed into a tool, has long since become more than an object. It is a participant in ritual, in nourishment, in care. And even now, before fingers touch it or the mortar bowl is drawn from its resting place beneath the shelf, it seems to hold memory in its weight, the memory of coriander seeds crushed into dust on cold mornings, of garlic mashed into a pungent paste that clung to the edges for hours, of rose petals ground so finely that they left behind nothing but scent and the faintest pink glow. And the woman, though still in sleep, curled gently beside her son beneath a blanket softened by the years, holds in the soft reaches of her, dreaming mind a sense of this stone, not its shape perhaps, but its rhythm, its weight in her hand, the way it presses down against the larger rock with a sound like breath, like the low whisper of effort folded into habit. And perhaps, in the dream she drifts within now, she sees her own mother's hands moving in, circles grinding something while speaking softly, words not remembered but voice still felt, or perhaps she dreams of the first time she taught her son to help, letting him sprinkle the cumin or turn the stone, laughing gently when he scattered, more than he kept. And though none of this is happening now, though the room is still and no scent rises, and no seeds shift in their baskets, the stone holds all of that within it, silently. And beside it the board bears faint grooves from years of service, and a few curled bits of dried spice cling to the corners, like reminders of meals not grand but sustaining. And the linen, cloth, folded once and then again, lies in a way that suggests it was last used with care, its edges crisp, its fibers darkened slightly with oil. And outside, the air begins to shift, to warm, to carry the faint sounds of distant footsteps, the creak of a cart's axle, a splash of water against stone, But inside, where the morning remains delicate and half-shaped, the grinding stone lies still, not needing to move to be meaningful, offering its quiet presence like a held breath, waiting to be lifted again, to serve again, to return again and again, to the slow, fragrant work that gives flavor to the ordinary. And so it rests, not inert, but alive with memory, pressed gently into the day that is just beginning to stir. As the day continues its quiet ascent, and the first full warmth of the sun spills over the rooftops and slides slowly down the clay walls of the courtyard, there begins to appear a soft, shifting shadow upon the far wall. A shadow that does not belong to any person or animal, but rather to the wooden beam that juts from the rooftop edge above, a structural stub from which ropes sometimes hang, or herbs are strung to dry in the deeper heat of afternoon, and as the light strengthens, this modest beam casts its shape down in silence, a lengthening blur of softened lines that creeps steadily along the surface like the unrolling of a scroll, the message of which is nothing more urgent than the passage of time. And though no one watches it directly, and no eyes are fixed upon it, the shadow continues to move in the slow, inevitable way that all natural things do, marking not the minutes or hours in measured units, but rather revealing the gentle arc of morning as it slips toward midday. And the wall itself, uneven and weather-worn, holds the shadow with dignity, its pitted surface and faint cracks lending texture to the moving shape, so that it appears not as a flat shade, but as a living presence, one that deepens and fades and elongates in rhythm with the turning of the sun. And inside, the woman, still emerging from sleep, stirs slightly as the warmth of that same sunlight reaches the edge of her mat, brushing against her covered feet like a whisper, like a familiar voice calling not for action, but for gentle awakening. And perhaps, though her eyes are not yet open, she feels the difference in light upon the wall through some long-practiced instinct, some internal compass, tied not to clocks or bells, but to the way light bends through her home. And outside, the shadow of the beam lengthens and dips, passing slowly over the storage jars placed neatly against the base of the wall, over the edge of a coiled rope, over the resting reed bundle, touching each item for only a moment before moving on, leaving no mark, needing no permission, and even the faint breeze that now begins to stir the lighter leaves of a nearby fig plant does not interrupt its course, for the shadow, untouchable yet ever present, continues in its silent mission. And the boy, curled near his mother, breathes evenly, the rhythm of his chest rising and falling with the same soft measure that the shadow follows on its downward path. And there is something timeless in the way the shape moves across the space, as if this same shadow, or one very like it, has visited this wall for generations, as if it too is part of the household, returning daily to perform its quiet dance, and should anyone pause later in the day to glance at the wall, they would not see the shadow in the same place, for it will have gone by then, replaced by the full light of noon, or the angled shafts of late afternoon, and yet its passing will have been recorded in the memory of the wall, in the warmth left behind, in the changing hue of dust upon its face. And in this way, the household tells time not by sound or ceremony, but by the light and the shadow, by the slow familiar movement of brightness across surfaces that hold it without effort. And so the beam remains in place above, and the wall receives its shadow below, and between them, time unfolds in perfect silence, a sacred rhythm hidden within the ordinary. Near the back of the courtyard, not far from the hearth and nestled against the lowest step that leads toward the small storage room, stands a large clay jar, broad in the middle and narrowing at the top, its rim flared slightly outward like a flower opening in slow motion, and though it has served the household faithfully for years, storing water, barley, dried legumes, or sometimes simply left empty, it now leans just barely to one side, as though tired from standing so long in that same place, its base uneven where the fired clay did not set perfectly flat, a subtle imperfection formed long ago in the kiln and never corrected, but instead simply accepted, lived with, trusted, anyway. And because it leans just a little, the family has placed a folded piece of woven reed mat beneath one edge to give it balance, a quiet act of adaptation that says more about their way of life than any grand design might. And this jar, with its soft brown tone mottled from sun and age, is not remarkable in its appearance, not adorned with patterns or handles or glaze. Yet it holds a quiet authority in the space, a presence born not from beauty, but from being useful, familiar, steady. And as the sunlight begins to stretch farther into the courtyard and the shadows shift around it, the jar casts its own, lopsided silhouette on the floor beside it, its shape as recognizable to the household as the face of a friend. And the woman, still inside, perhaps now half awake and sensing the world with closed eyes, knows this jar as she knows the slope of her son's shoulder or the sound of wind against the reed curtain. And though she has not yet risen to touch it today, her body remembers lifting its lid, dipping in a ladle to pour water into a smaller vessel, brushing the dust from its rim with the edge of her sleeve, checking its contents without needing to look. And the clay, cool still in the shadow, holds not just substance but memory, the faint scent of grain or oil lingering in its porous walls, the feel of past seasons pressed into its surface, and around its base small trails of dust have collected where wind has passed through, where tiny insects once traveled, where a dropped thread of barley husk still rests like a forgotten thought. And though it leans, though it is not perfect, the jar remains trusted, used, depended upon, not replaced, not discarded, because it does what it must without complaint. And that in this home is more than enough. And should the boy walk past it later, as he often does, he might brush his hand against its side without thinking, the way one greets a post or a tree in passing, not with ceremony, but with quiet acknowledgement. And the jar, as always, will respond with stillness, with coolness, with presence, and in that leaning shape is the essence of this place, a willingness to adjust, to support, to hold, and to be held. And even now, as morning rises and the sun begins to warm the courtyard floor more completely, the jar remains where it has always been, slightly tilted, gently balanced, silently doing what it was made to do, embodying not perfection but peace. Even as the morning light fully enters the courtyard and begins to spill across the clay walls and wooden beams with the lazy confidence of a sun well into its upward climb, there lingers in the still shaded recess beneath the hearth a faint and familiar scent, the dry, earthy trace of yesterday's ash, subtle and steady, rising just enough to be noticed when one passes close or bends to stir the fire anew, though no fire burns there now, and no warmth pulses from its stones, only the cool memory of heat that once was, and the ash, pale grey and feather-soft, lies in thin layers, tucked between the crevices of baked earth and scattered across the soot-darkened floor of the shallow pit. Left undisturbed after the cooking ended the evening before, preserved not by intention, but by the natural quiet that follows work when all is done and there is nothing more to stir, and this scent, so minor it might be missed altogether, by someone unfamiliar with the house, is deeply woven into the atmosphere of the home, part of its background essence, like the scent of woven reed, of sun-warmed clay, of old spices ground into the boards. And though it holds no sweetness, no sharpness, no floral hue, it is a scent that says something has been made here, something has been warmed and shared and tasted and finished. And the woman, even as she stirs now in her sleep and drifts toward wakefulness, would recognize it without thought, the way one knows the softness of a well-used blanket or the sound of footsteps in one's own home. And perhaps in her dream, she walks again around the hearth in earlier light, lifting a pot from the stones, stirring lentils, with the curved wooden spoon her father once carved, listening to the slow bubbling sound that now lives only in memory. And beside the hearth lie the tools still waiting to be used again. The small shovel for scooping ash, the flattened board for resting pots, the cloth used to wrap the handle when it grows too warm to touch. And none of these have been moved, for morning has not yet reached the hour of rekindling the fire, and the day still holds in its hands the last moments of sleep. And yet the scent is present, low and steady, rising just enough to mark the hearth's place in the rhythm of the house, as though the ashes themselves remember the purpose they once held. And outside a breeze brushes against the outer wall, but does not enter. The air within the courtyard remains still, preserving the scent in place as though time itself were holding its breath. And the boy, still wrapped in dreams and the warmth of his blanket, does not move, but perhaps too he carries in his Memory, the taste of bread warmed over those ashes, the way steam rose from it when broken apart, the way his mother's voice sounded soft and close as she said his name. And so the scent, invisible yet unmistakable, weaves itself through the coolness of the courtyard air, not loud or demanding, but patient and sure, a signal that this, home though quiet now, has known work and warmth, has fed its people, has listened to the crackle of fire and the low hum of evening conversations. And even in stillness, the hearth speaks, and its ashes tell a story not of ending, but of pause, of waiting, of the quiet certainty that warmth will come again, when it is needed, and until then its breath, faint and smoky and haughty, remains. Hanging in the doorway that connects the inner living space to the courtyard, not a solid barrier, not a heavy door, but a curtain made of reeds strung together with thick thread and tied at the top to a horizontal pole worn smooth from years of holding its weight. The curtain moves ever so slightly with the wind, breathing in its own quiet rhythm, swaying gently forward and then back, never swinging wildly, never stirring the air with noise or rush, but rather shifting with the kind of grace that comes only from long practice and soft resistance, each reed pressing lightly against its neighbor, clicking faintly from time to time like distant beads, or the slow ticking of a wooden clock that tells time not by numbers but by mood, and the wind that stirs it is not strong or cold, but warm and soft, rising from the sunlit yard and entering the room like a respectful guest, lifting the edge of the curtain just high enough to let light trickle through, to let air wander past without asking permission, carrying with it the subtle sense of clay, dust, and distant water, and the reeds, many of them now slightly frayed at the ends, their golden brown color faded by years of sun and use, carry the story of the riverbank where they were once cut, smoothed by hands, and shaped into even lengths, their hollow cores making them light enough to dance but sturdy enough to endure. And in the earliest mornings like now, when the household remains in that space between sleep and movement, the curtain becomes a kind of heartbeat between two worlds, the inner and the outer, the still and the stirring, the private hush of the family and the wider sounds of the street beyond. And as the breeze passes through it, not only does the air change, but so too does the light, broken into soft stripes that ripple across the earthen floor like shadows from a dream, moving gently across sleeping mats, over the rim of the water jar, and up the wall toward the hanging baskets that do not stir. And the woman, now just beginning to open her eyes to the familiar dimness of the inner room, sees the movement of the curtain before anything else, the way it pulses gently, the way it has always pulsed at this hour, like the room itself is exhaling slowly, after a night of quiet breath. And perhaps she remembers in this first waking moment how she used to sit just inside the doorway as a girl, watching the curtain move and wondering whether wind had a voice, whether it whispered only to the reeds, and her son, still curled beneath the blanket nearby, makes no sound, but his toes are just close enough to the shifting stripes of filtered light that they begin to warm, even as he sleeps, kissed gently. By the day that has only just arrived, and the curtain sways again, slower this time, then stills for a moment as though listening, and in its stillness, the room listens too, and then the wind returns, playful and quiet, brushing the curtain's edge as if to say, "I'm still here." And the home, in its deep familiarity with such things, breathes in response, not with voice or gesture, but with the slight creak of clay, the hush of cloth shifting slightly on the mat, the quiet pulse of life continuing just as it always has. And so the reed curtain, humble and thin and handmade, becomes not just a divider of space, but a living presence, a soft reminder that the world moves gently through every crack and corner, offering not noise or urgency, but breath, rhythm, and light. Against the wall of the main living space, beneath a faded clay niche where a simple oil lamp sometimes sits during the darker hours of evening, stands a modest wooden shelf. Low to the ground, no taller than a child's knee, its surface smoothed by decades of gentle hands, placing and retrieving the same small collection of folded cloths, always in the same arrangement, with the same patient care. And this shelf, made long ago from local wood by someone whose name has long since faded into memory, but whose skill is remembered in every smooth corner and joined seam, has served quietly and without complaint, holding its load not with pride, but with purpose, as if it knows the comfort it gives by simply being there, familiar and reliable. And upon the shelf, 3 neatly stacked piles of cloth sit in a row, each slightly different in tone and texture, all worn soft with use and age. The edges frayed just enough to speak of history without signaling damage, and the first pile, closest to the corner, consists of the coarsest cloths, the ones used to dry the family's feet after bathing, or to wrap bread before it cools too quickly, their fibers still faintly bearing the scent of river water or barley flour. And the second stack, smoother and thinner, contains the cloths, used for covering jars, for shielding food from dust, or occasionally for wrapping around a child's shoulders when the wind slips through the courtyard late in the evening. And the third stack, placed with particular attention to alignment, holds the softest pieces, those set aside for more delicate uses, to dab at foreheads when illness comes, to line the inside of a sleeping mat on colder nights, or to be handed silently and without instruction to someone who needs to feel the closeness of something that has been kept warm and clean. And each cloth, though folded in perfect stillness, now carries the memory of movement, of being shaken out in sunlight, of being rinsed beneath a dripping jar, of being held in a child's hands and pulled along the floor in imitation of sweeping. And the woman, now sitting slowly upright on her mat nearby, eyes adjusting to the softened brightness of day, glances once at the shelf without needing to move, her gaze landing with quiet recognition, not to check whether anything has changed, but to reconnect with something constant. For this shelf, this small corner of order, has been the anchor of her mornings for as long as she can remember, a place where things are always as they should be, where nothing ever seems out of place, even if the rest of the world turns untidy. And the boy, still nestled beside her, stirs slightly, but does not yet rise, his breathing steady, his dreams slipping further away as the sounds of waking life begin to gather. And outside, a soft murmur begins to rise from the neighboring courtyard, not loud, just the stirring of another home, another rhythm, but inside, this shelf, with its 3 small stacks of folded cloth, remains untouched, for now serene in its order, holding the weight of ordinary care and the gentleness of daily rituals that require no ceremony. And in its simplicity, in the way it waits without needing attention, it offers the room a kind of balance, a soft-spoken reminder that care is often quiet, that order can be humble, and that something as small as a folded cloth can carry the warmth of a home. In the stillness just before the first true movement of the household begins, before the mat is folded, before the jars are lifted, before the courtyard hums with the rhythm of footsteps and softly spoken words, a small act takes place so quietly, so routinely, that it almost escapes notice. The placing of a wooden utensil beside the wide-mouthed cooking pot that will soon receive its morning portion of water and grain, a gesture so familiar that the hand performing it does not pause, does not question, does not even consciously register the movement anymore, and yet in that brief, gentle moment lies the very soul of the day's beginning, and the utensil, a long, slightly curved stirring stick carved years ago from tamarisk wood and worn, smooth by repeated use, bears along its handle the soft polish of fingertips and the shallow nicks of older meals prepared and served and forgotten, its lower edge darkened permanently from frequent immersion in boiling lentils or barley, and it is not fancy, not ornate, not engraved or marked, but it has become more dear than any decoration, for it has never failed in its purpose and never once required replacement, though the woman, even in her youth, had thought once or twice of carving a new one, perhaps slimmer or straighter. But each time she touched it, held it, watched it stir slowly through a bubbling mixture, she knew it would remain. And so, this morning, as she rises in quiet preparation, still barefoot, her hair loosely bound with a strip of cloth, and her eyes still adjusting to the brightness creeping into the courtyard, she takes the spoon from the shelf and sets it beside the pot, not loudly, not carefully, but with that exact pressure of someone who knows exactly where it belongs. And beside the spoon lies the clay pot, wide and low, shaped for even heating, resting patiently atop the flat stones of the hearth's edge, empty for now but not for long, its walls already beginning to warm faintly as the morning air settles around it, and though the fire has not yet been lit, and the wood still waits stacked near the courtyard wall, the placement of the spoon marks the first true commitment to the day's labor, a quiet announcement not of urgency, but of readiness. And outside, a faint rustle of palm leaves can be heard swaying with the rising breeze, and beyond that, the distant call of a street vendor barely reaches the threshold. But inside this moment, the spoon beside the pot is all that matters. And the boy, now half awake, hears the soft clack of wood touching clay, and knows without looking that his mother is beginning the morning. That soon there will be the smell of toasted grain, the simmering of milk, the gentle hum of breakfast in progress. And to him that sound is safer than speech, more certain than sunrise, and so he stretches slowly, rolls onto his side, and smiles before sleep fully leaves him. And the woman, still silent, still scented, adjusts the pot slightly, touches the spoon once more, and then steps away to fetch water, her footsteps light, deliberate, soft as dust. And in this home, this rhythm, this placing of an object before action, is not ceremonial but sacred all the same, and the spoon, though simple, holds within it the weight of countless mornings just like this one, a companion to heat, to hunger, to care, and so it rests there now, not yet lifted but waiting, and in its stillness lies the promise of food, of movement, of the slow unfolding of one more ordinary day. Just inside the doorway that leads from the courtyard to the outer passage, where feet pass often but not hurriedly, and where the woven reed curtain brushes against the walls with each soft breath of air, there lies a faint, unremarkable accumulation of dust, the kind not swept every day but tended to only when the rhythm of the week allows, a gathering of particles so fine they resemble powdered sand, settled there not by neglect but by life's natural motion. And this dust, pale, grey with hints of ochre and beige, carries within its weightless layers the memory of movement, the brushing of feet both bare and sandaled, the drift of wind through open spaces, the fall of ash from the edge of a mat or the shaking out of a cloak, and it collects slowly, gently over hours and days, forming a delicate crescent shape against the threshold, where the earthen floor rises ever so slightly before descending into the open alley beyond. And though the dust is easily disturbed, it is rarely scattered violently, for the people who live here walk without stomping, pass through doorways without rush, move from space to space with the steady pace of those who live closely with time. And the woman of the house, who has just returned from the well with a full jar of water balanced against her hip, glances down at the dust as she enters and thinks, without thinking, that it will be swept tomorrow, or perhaps the next day, when the child is rested and the cooking is light. And she steps over it, her toes grazing the edge without stirring it, her shadow moving across it in one long ribbon, and in its softness, the dust does not complain, or shift, but continues to rest where it has gathered, pressed slightly in places by heel prints or by the gentle scrape of a jar's base, never sharp, never messy, but merely there, settled as if by agreement with the house itself, and the boy, now seated near the center of the courtyard, with a piece of dried date in his hand, and sleep still soft in his eyes, glances idly toward. The doorway sees the dust as he always does, and pays it no mind, for to him it is part of the home's natural design, as familiar as the jars and the mats and the rhythm of his mother's footsteps, and the morning wind, entering in small, respectful draughts through the open arch, picks up only the faintest whisper of the dust, never enough to lift it, but enough to make it shimmer for a moment like the surface of still water touched by a breeze. And outside, the sun continues its rise, casting warm rectangles of light across the outer wall and beginning to heat the stone beneath the fig tree. But inside, near the threshold, the dust remains cool, untouched by direct light, nestled between shadow and silence. And perhaps, later in the quiet space between meals, the woman will retrieve her broom, made of date palm fibers bound with leather, and sweep the dust into a small pile, then into a curved clay tray, and carry it with slow steps to the alley's edge. But for now the dust is left in place, part of the day's unfolding like every other element of this house, and in its presence is a lesson in patience, in the beauty of the unnoticed, in how a home breathes not just through its movement, but through its moments of stillness. And so the dust resting gently against the threshold remains not forgotten but allowed, a quiet witness to the soft passing of time. Near the far corner of the courtyard, beside the wall where shadows collect in the early afternoon, and where the air grows stillest in the hottest hours, there sits a rounded clay jar, darkened from years of handling and sun exposure, and resting. Atop it, slightly askew, never fully flush with the rim, is a lid that never quite fits. A disc of fired earth just a touch too wide, its edges gently chipped from time and use, made once for another jar long since broken, now repurposed with quiet resolve to serve this one instead, and though it rocks slightly when placed or removed, though it never seals tightly or rests with certainty, it is kept all the same, not because there are no better options, but because its near fit is enough. And in this home where everything carries the fingerprints of use and memory, where imperfection is not cause for rejection, but invitation for adaptation, the ill-fitting lid has become part of the rhythm of storage and retrieval, a small wobble accepted as part of the daily soundscape. The tap-tap as it's nudged into position now as familiar as the creak of the gate or the shuffle of feet across the mat. And the jar it covers holds dried chickpeas this season, though in other months it may hold rice or millet or nothing at all, depending on what has been traded, what has been grown, what has been saved. And each time the woman lifts the lid, she does so not with frustration, but with the kind of muscle memory that no longer registers the imperfection, her hands guiding it with practiced ease, tilting and turning it just enough so that it settles into its slightly tilted posture, the way one might settle a child's head on a pillow with care, despite its restlessness. And sometimes, especially in the stillest moments of midday, when no wind stirs and no footsteps echo, a bird may land on the jar's edge, tilting the lid ever so slightly further, before flying off and leaving it askew again, prompting the woman or her son to pass later and nudge it back into place with the back of a knuckle, restoring its usual imbalance. And this small act, repeated countless times and rarely noticed, is part of the quiet maintenance of the household, the series of gestures that are not discussed or planned, but that preserve the sense of rightness that allows each day to feel whole. And though someone unfamiliar might wonder why the lid is not replaced, why a new one has not been shaped and fired to fit, those who live here understand that time has already shaped this one into belonging, not in form, but in story. And in the afternoons, when the light grows heavier and more golden, the shadow of the jar and its tilting lid stretches long across the floor, broken only by the folds of a nearby mat or the edge of the broom propped against the wall, and the boy, returning from the outer gate with dust on his legs and something in his hands, passes by the jar and rests for a moment beside it, setting down his prize, a stone, a stick, a leaf, and idly tapping the lid with one finger, hearing its hollow click, smiling without reason, then walking on, and the lid tilts again, just a little, its imbalance persistent, its usefulness undiminished, its story unchanged, and so it remains not perfect, not seamless, but part of the house nonetheless, trusted to cover, trusted to guard, trusted to exist as it is. And in its tilted rest, it holds not just what lies inside the jar, but a quiet, wordless testament to the way this household endures. Between the courtyard and the slightly raised platform that leads to the rear storage area, where baskets are stacked, ropes coiled, and tools placed with quiet care, lies a short series of steps, just 3 in total, carved roughly from local stone long ago and worn smooth in the centers by countless bare feet pressing down with just enough pressure to leave memory without leaving damage. And among them, the middle step is uneven. Not dramatically, not dangerously, but just enough that it dips slightly to one side, forming a shallow slope toward the left. A detail so minor that it is never spoken about aloud, never marked, never repaired, but one that every person in the house has long since learned to accommodate without needing to remember they're doing it. And each time the woman climbs the steps, a jar in one arm or a folded cloth in her hand, her foot instinctively lands on the flatter right side of the middle step, guided not by thought, but by years of repetition. The same way one reaches for the door edge without looking or finishes a sentence that's always said the same way. and the boy, even in his distracted state, chasing shadows or daydreams, moves across the step without pause, shifting slightly. At the last moment, as if the unevenness speaks directly to his feet in a language older than logic, and the step itself, worn and pale with age, bears the faint lines of weathering and time. Small grains of sand gathered in its lower corner, a tiny piece of dried straw pressed flat against the surface, where the dipping edge collects the slow sediment of daily life. And sometimes, during heavier rains or when water is carried too carelessly from the courtyard basin, a small puddle gathers on that sunken side, reflecting the wall beside it, catching for a brief moment the golden glow of a low flame or the pale color of someone's heel. And yet the puddle too is managed with practiced ease, sidestepped without fuss, soaked into a cloth without commentary, as if the stone itself were expected to misbehave in this small familiar way. And once, long ago, when a visitor entered who did not know the household well, she stumbled just slightly on that step, catching herself with a quiet laugh, and afterward the boy asked his mother why they never fixed it, to which she only smiled and said, "It doesn't need fixing if you know it's there." And somehow in that one sentence, the entire philosophy of the home unfolded. That some things, left imperfect, become part of the way a place lives, teaching familiarity not through correction, but through gentle adaptation. And now, the step remains unchanged and unchanging, patient as stone always is, unmoved by urgency, untouched by ambition, perfectly content to be what it is. And in the middle of the day, when the light slants across the courtyard and spills in a wide beam over the steps, that uneven middle stone casts a slightly crooked shadow, one that bends just enough to be noticed if you're watching. One that reminds anyone who sees it that homes are not made of symmetry and perfection, but of softness, routine, and the wordless agreements between people and the spaces they inhabit. And so the step remains, solid and slanted, a small imperfection, embraced without question, walked over again and again by the rhythm of daily life that turns without effort, carrying with it the quiet beauty of things that are exactly as they are meant to be. On the wall beside the inner doorway, just past the point where shadows fold into the clay like ink into old parchment, and above the height of the boy's reach, but just beneath the woman's shoulder, there is a single wooden peg, not part of a row, not adorned with carving or paint, not newly made nor entirely straight, but there all the same, steadfast and quiet in its purpose. And from that peg hangs one woven basket, round and shallow, shaped like an open palm, made of tightly wound reeds interlaced with darker strands that reveal a pattern only when the light strikes at a low angle, the kind of subtle design that only emerges when one has time to pause and notice. And even then it slips away again if you look too hard, and the peg, made from a branch smoothed by hand, set into the wall so long ago that the clay has reshaped slightly around its base, holds the basket with a slight forward tilt, just enough to suggest readiness, just enough to suggest use, and that basket, simple in its form and seasoned by repetition, serves no single purpose but rather all purposes at once, having held figs drying in the sun and cloth waiting to be stitched, and once a pile of acorns brought home by the boy, who insisted they be kept until he could count them again the next day. And now, on this quiet morning, in the calm breath, between dawn and labor, the basket is empty, gently swinging just slightly as the wind moves through the open door, its weight so balanced that even a breeze can rock it, and that gentle sway creates a barely audible creak from the peg, a soft whisper of wood against reed, a noise so faint it vanishes as soon as it is heard, yet still part of the soundscape, of the home. And the woman, moving past with a shallow bowl in her hands, glances toward it not because anything is wrong, but because her eyes always seek it in passing, the way one always notices the same tree at the bend in the road, or the same mark on a page. And the boy, seated near the low shelf where his morning tasks begin, looks at the basket and briefly imagines it holding feathers, or round stones, or folded messages, things he has no need to carry but likes, to imagine gathering. And the basket, for its part, carries all those things too in memory if not in weight, and it accepts each purpose given to it without protest or pride, never changing, never requiring thanks. And though there are other baskets in the home, some stacked in corners and others tucked beneath shelves, this one remains visible, hung, waiting, serving as both container and symbol. For in its quiet presence is the mark of a house that keeps what it uses and uses what it keeps, that allows each object its place not just in space, but in story. And the peg itself, aged and darkened by touch, creaks once more as the wind turns, and the basket sways, forward then stills again, coming to rest in that slightly tilted posture it always returns to, not perfectly straight but reliably so. And in that resting shape is the whole nature of the home, stable but not stiff, enduring but not rigid, a place where time moves, in gentle loops, and where even the simplest corner holds something worth watching if one only slows down enough to see. As the morning deepens and the courtyard grows brighter in the slow, patient way of places, not ruled by clocks or urgency, a patch of sunlight begins its daily journey across the floor, entering first as a sliver through the upper opening of the courtyard wall, where the beams meet at uneven angles and leave just enough space for light to filter through like honey spilling from a cracked jar, golden and thick but slow. And that first sliver stretches cautiously forward, growing by the minute into a warm, gentle oval that reaches the edge of the room, pauses briefly as if considering whether to enter, then begins its familiar path, toward the sleeping mat laid near the wall, where the boy lies on his side, half awake, one arm curled under his cheek, his breath steady and quiet. And the sunlight, as though remembering this route from 1,000 mornings past, inches its way over the uneven clay floor, brushing first against the folded edge of the mat, then creeping toward the boy's feet, which twitch slightly in response, not from discomfort, but from that quiet awareness that light brings, the kind that doesn't require waking, but merely makes itself known, and slowly, steadily the sunlight continues to grow, spreading across the woven fibers of the mat like a soft tide, warming the faded cloth, picking out the threads that are looser than others, and casting faint shadows into the tiny dips where the mat has worn thin from use. And as it reaches the boy's knees, the warmth begins to nudge him from slumber, not with sound or shaking, but with the promise of day, of breakfast, of movement. And his body, though still wrapped in rest, shifts slightly, pulling the edge of the mat closer, tucking one leg beneath the other as if to negotiate just a few minutes more before rising. And the woman, watching quietly from the opposite side of the room, sees this familiar play between sunlight and child and smiles without moving, for it is the same each morning. The sun arrives not with force but with patience, a visitor that enters respectfully, never rushing, always welcome. And in the space where it lands, everything softens. The folds of cloth, the silence of the air, even the dust motes which now dance lazily in the warmth, rising and falling like tiny lanterns. And the mat, with its wear and patches, its frayed corner and faint scent of straw, cradles the sunlight as it would a child, accepting the heat into its fibers without resistance, becoming not just a place to rest, but a canvas for the light's slow story. And by the time the full patch of sun rests across the boy's torso, his eyes have begun to blink open, not sharply, not with complaint, but with the ease of someone waking into something known, something kind. And he lies there for a moment longer, letting the warmth hold him, letting the day begin in silence. And the room around him listens, not just with ears, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that only truly old homes know, the kind built not of walls, but of repeated mornings, of the sound of breath and birds, and the stretching of light across familiar places. And so the sun continues its soft climb, and the mat holds its light, and the boy, half awake and fully home, stretches just slightly and begins to rise, bringing with him the warmth of that light like a blanket carried across the beginning of a new ordinary day. Folded neatly and placed on a low ledge beside the mat, beneath a section of wall that holds the warmth of the morning sun longer than any other, lies the family's oldest blanket, a piece of thick, loosely woven fabric made from soft, earth-colored threads that have long since faded from their original shade into something gentler, something that resembles the space between brown and beige, between sand and dusk. And though it is folded now with care, edges aligned, and weight evenly distributed, one corner always sags slightly forward, draping over the ledge like a tired arm, never quite conforming to the rest, its threads looser, its weave stretched thin from years of pulling, of wrapping, of being tucked tightly under feet or shoulders on colder nights. And that corner, more than any other part of the blanket, tells the story of its service, of countless evenings spent beside the fire, of children wrapped tightly while fevers passed, of early morning stillness when it served not just to warm, but to comfort, to hold something in place. And the woman who remembers the blanket, when it was new, when it was gifted to her as a wedding offering, smiles faintly each time she touches that worn edge, because though it is frayed, though it has lost its strength, it is the part of the blanket that feels most alive. And over the years, as smaller blankets came and went, patched and mended, or given to others, this one remained, always returned to its ledge after use, always the last one placed over a sleeping body when the nights turned too cold for pride. And the boy, still young but not as small as he once was, knows that corner well, has chewed on it as a toddler, has hidden under it during sudden winds, has wrapped it around his knees during storms when the walls seemed too thin to keep out the world. And even now, as he moves about the courtyard, stretching and waking and beginning to gather his small duties, he passes the blanket and gives the sagging corner a quick tug, more out of habit than need, the way one greets an old friend without speaking, and the cloth responds with a soft sway, a rustle barely audible, like leaves brushing each other in a breeze. And the sun now catches the blanket's surface, warming it slowly, revealing the differences in texture between the newer folds and the older stretch, the patch sewn long ago with darker thread, the small burn mark near the edge from a coal that once jumped free from the brazier. And it is not a beautiful blanket by the measure of new things, but it is beautiful in the way that familiar things are, in the softness of repetition, in the kindness of endurance, in the quiet memory it carries in its weight. And should anyone ever suggest it be replaced, the woman would only smile and shake her head, not with defiance, but with the calm certainty of someone who knows that some things are not kept because they are perfect, but because they are true. And so the blanket remains folded neatly each morning, used without ceremony each night, its corner always slightly loose, always ready to be tucked again, touched again, depended on. And in that one small, sagging edge lies the whole rhythm of the home, things used well, cared for simply, and never discarded before their story is done. In the farthest corner of the courtyard, where the sun's reach is briefest and the air stays cool even as the rest of the home begins to stir with quiet warmth, there sits a wide, shallow basin made of heavy fired clay, its edges curved like the rim of a full moon and its surface worn smooth from years of use, not polished deliberately, but shaped slowly by the touch of countless hands and the press of vessels dipping in and out. And this basin, though empty now, though still and quiet and touched only by the occasional drifting leaf, holds in its silence the memory of water, the way it used to shine in the morning light when filled, the way it would ripple when disturbed by ladles and palms, the soft echo it once made when struck by accident with a metal rim. And the woman, now crouching nearby with a small woven fan in her lap, glances toward the basin, not with urgency, but with recognition, as one looks toward an old object that no longer needs to prove its purpose, because its very presence confirms its worth. And the basin, despite being unfilled, despite being cool to the touch and shadowed by the overhanging wall, still plays a role in the slow unfolding of the household's rhythm, waiting to be needed, patient in the way that only stone and clay can be, accepting the passage of time not as loss, but as practice. And perhaps by midday it will hold water again, carried by the boy or his mother, poured slowly from a jar, held at the hip, the water splashing gently against the curved sides, settling into stillness with a surface that reflects the overhead sky. And perhaps it will be used for washing, or for cooling fruits, or for soaking reeds that will be twisted into cord, or maybe it will remain untouched today, its utility postponed, its waiting continued. But even in waiting it is not idle, for the very act of being available, of holding the potential for usefulness, is enough. And the boy, now passing by with his hands damp from the small water pot near the entry, slows slightly as he sees the basin, remembering without speaking the many days he has sat beside it, dipped his feet into its coolness, watched insects land on the surface, heard the slow drip of water falling from a ladle's edge. And he pauses for a moment, rests one hand on its rim, and then continues on, leaving behind only a trace of warmth where his fingers pressed against the clay, and the basin, unmoved and unchanged, stays nestled in its corner, its interior lightly, dusted with the fine silt that the air always carries, its walls bearing the soft stains of seasons past, its base half ringed by a thin line where water once dried in late summer, and overhead a bird calls once from the rooftop, and a breeze stirs the air just enough to send a curled leaf spinning down to land near the basin's edge, where it joins a small collection of others. And even these leaves, gathered gently rather than swept away, seem part of the basin's patience, its quiet collection of the world's slower movements. And when the woman rises at last and walks past it again, she places her palm briefly on its rim in passing, as if acknowledging an old friend, as if saying not yet, but soon. And the basin in its stillness waits without question, cradling both shadow and memory in equal measure, and remaining what it has always been, a vessel for whatever the day might bring. As the last of the day fades from the walls, and the soft indigo of twilight settles gently over the clay and reed of the home, a hush begins to return. Not sudden, not imposed, but flowing in gradually like river mist, threading through doorways, wrapping around the corners of the courtyard, and settling upon the household with a weightless calm that feels familiar, earned, and complete. And the family, having moved through the slow rituals of their evening, the folding of mats, the dimming of the lamp, the setting aside of the bowl and the reed spoon and the water jar, now returns to stillness, each member drawn into the quiet, not by exhaustion but by a kind of ancient rhythm, the internal clock that homes without timepieces still obey. And the boy, now curled beneath the old blanket whose frayed corner rests beside his cheek, breathes evenly, eyes already closed, his limbs heavy with the kind of tiredness that doesn't protest or resist, but simply gives way. And nearby the woman lowers herself onto the mat she has used since her own youth, the woven pattern almost invisible now but still intact, still carrying the memory of every night she has lain upon it, and she rests her hand lightly on her belly, on her breath, on the simple truth that this is her place. And above them, the stars have begun to blink softly into view beyond the narrow opening above the courtyard, and though only a few can be seen from where they lie, they are enough, just enough to remind them that the world continues in its turning, just as their home continues in its silence. And somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, and then the sound dissolves into the warm, dusty dark, and a pot creaks slightly as it cools near the hearth, and the reed curtain moves a little with the gentlest drift of air, and none of it is jarring. None of it disturbs the peace that now pools through every corner of the home. And even the old wooden peg by the wall, now no longer bearing the weight of the basket, which has been moved beside the shelf for morning use, seems to lean back into the clay a little more deeply, as if it too is resting. And the basin in the corner, empty again, catches the last of the day's warmth in its stone and holds it silently, asking nothing. And so the home breathes, if such things can be said to breathe, not with lungs or lips, but with the gentle expansion and contraction of a space that has welcomed the day, held it, and now releases it. And the woman closes her eyes last, her ears still open to every sound, not out of worry, but out of that attentiveness that never fully sleeps, that motherhood makes permanent. And she listens for a moment longer, to the steady exhale of the child, to the sigh of the night, wind against the wall, to the distant murmur of the city beyond, and finally to the deep silence that has returned. And in that silence, there is no emptiness, no loneliness, only fullness, the fullness of a life lived simply, of a night accepted without drama or danger, of a home that holds its people not just with shelter, but with memory. And in that final stillness, as all things settle into the gentle grip of sleep, the house becomes a single breathing being, not made of brick or straw or stone alone, but of ritual and rhythm and rest. And in that place, on that mat beneath the stars and behind the reed curtain, the boy and his mother fall completely into slumber, and the night unfolds, slow and silent, like a blanket drawn gently over the world. the world. The same way one reaches for the door edge without looking or finishes a sentence that's always said the same way. And the boy, even in his distracted state, chasing shadows or daydreams, moves across the step without pause, shifting slightly. At the last moment, as if the unevenness speaks directly to his feet in a language older than logic. And the step itself, worn and pale with age, bears the faint lines of weathering and time. Small grains of sand gathered in its lower corner, a tiny piece of dried straw pressed flat against the surface, where the dipping edge collects the slow sediment of daily life. And sometimes, during heavier rains or when water is carried too carelessly from the courtyard basin, a small puddle gathers on that sunken side, reflecting the wall beside it, catching for a brief moment the golden glow of a low flame or the pale color of someone's heel. And yet the puddle too is managed with practiced ease, sidestepped without fuss, soaked into a cloth without commentary, as if the stone itself were expected to misbehave in this small familiar way. And once, long ago, when a visitor entered who did not know the household well, she stumbled just slightly on that step, catching herself with a quiet laugh, and afterward the boy asked his mother why they never fixed it, to which she only smiled and said, "It doesn't need fixing if you know it's there." And somehow in that one sentence, the entire philosophy of the home unfolded. That some things, left imperfect, become part of the way a place lives, teaching familiarity not through correction, but through gentle adaptation. And now, the step remains unchanged and unchanging, patient as stone always is, unmoved by urgency, untouched by ambition, perfectly content to be what it is. And in the middle of the day, when the light slants across the courtyard and spills in a wide beam over the steps, that uneven middle stone casts a slightly crooked shadow, one that bends just enough to be noticed if you're watching. One that reminds anyone who sees it that homes are not made of symmetry and perfection, but of softness, routine, and the wordless agreements between people and the spaces they inhabit. And so the step remains, solid and slanted, a small imperfection, embraced without question, walked over again and again by the rhythm of daily life that turns without effort, carrying with it the quiet beauty of things that are exactly as they are meant to be. On the wall beside the inner doorway, just past the point where shadows fold into the clay like ink into old parchment, and above the height of the boy's reach, but just beneath the woman's shoulder, there is a single wooden peg, not part of a row, not adorned with carving or paint, not newly made nor entirely straight, but there all the same, steadfast and quiet in its purpose. And from that peg hangs one woven basket, round and shallow, shaped like an open palm, made of tightly wound reeds interlaced with darker strands that reveal a pattern only when the light strikes at a low angle, the kind of subtle design that only emerges when one has time to pause and notice. And even then it slips away again if you look too hard, and the peg, made from a branch smoothed by hand, set into the wall so long ago that the clay has reshaped slightly around its base, holds the basket with a slight forward tilt, just enough to suggest readiness, just enough to suggest use, and that basket, simple in its form and seasoned by repetition, serves no single purpose but rather all purposes at once, having held figs drying in the sun, and cloth waiting to be stitched, and once a pile of acorns brought home by the boy, who insisted they be kept until he could count them again the next day. And now, on this quiet morning, in the calm breath, between dawn and labor, the basket is empty, gently swinging just slightly as the wind moves through the open door, its weight so balanced that even a breeze can rock it, and that gentle sway creates a barely audible creak from the peg, a soft whisper of wood against reed, a noise so faint it vanishes as soon as it is heard, yet still part of the soundscape, of the home. And the woman, moving past with a shallow bowl in her hands, glances toward it not because anything is wrong, but because her eyes always seek it in passing, the way one always notices the same tree at the bend in the road, or the same mark on a page. And the boy, seated near the low shelf where his morning tasks begin, looks at the basket and briefly imagines it holding feathers, or round stones, or folded messages, things he has no need to carry but likes, to imagine gathering. And the basket, for its part, carries all those things too in memory if not in weight, and it accepts each purpose given to it without protest or pride, never changing, never requiring thanks. And though there are other baskets in the home, some stacked in corners and others tucked beneath shelves, this one remains visible, hung, waiting, serving as both container and symbol. For in its quiet presence is the mark of a house that keeps what it uses and uses what it keeps, that allows each object its place not just in space, but in story. And the peg itself, aged and darkened by touch, creaks once more as the wind turns, and the basket sways, forward then stills again, coming to rest in that slightly tilted posture it always returns to, not perfectly straight but reliably so. And in that resting shape is the whole nature of the home, stable but not stiff, enduring but not rigid, a place where time moves, in gentle loops, and where even the simplest corner holds something worth watching if one only slows down enough to see. As the morning deepens and the courtyard grows brighter in the slow, patient way of places, not ruled by clocks or urgency, a patch of sunlight begins its daily journey across the floor, entering first as a sliver through the upper opening of the courtyard wall, where the beams meet at uneven angles and leave just enough space for light to filter through like honey spilling from a cracked jar, golden and thick but slow. And that first sliver stretches cautiously forward, growing by the minute into a warm, gentle oval that reaches the edge of the room, pauses briefly as if considering whether to enter, then begins its familiar path, toward the sleeping mat laid near the wall, where the boy lies on his side, half awake, one arm curled under his cheek, his breath steady and quiet. And the sunlight, as though remembering this route from 1,000 mornings past, inches its way over the uneven clay floor, brushing first against the folded edge of the mat, then creeping toward the boy's feet, which twitch slightly in response, not from discomfort, but from that quiet awareness that light brings, the kind that doesn't require waking, but merely makes itself known, and slowly, steadily the sunlight continues to grow, spreading across the woven fibers of the mat like a soft tide, warming the faded cloth, picking out the threads that are looser than others, and casting faint shadows into the tiny dips where the mat has worn thin from use. And as it reaches the boy's knees, the warmth begins to nudge him from slumber, not with sound or shaking, but with the promise of day, of breakfast, of movement. And his body, though still wrapped in rest, shifts slightly, pulling the edge of the mat closer, tucking one leg beneath the other as if to negotiate just a few minutes more before rising. And the woman, watching quietly from the opposite side of the room, sees this familiar play between sunlight and child and smiles without moving, for it is the same each morning. The sun arrives not with force but with patience, a visitor that enters respectfully, never rushing, always welcome. And in the space where it lands, everything softens. The folds of cloth, the silence of the air, even the dust motes which now dance lazily in the warmth, rising and falling like tiny lanterns, and the mat, with its wear and patches, its frayed corner and faint scent of straw, cradles the sunlight as it would a child, accepting the heat into its fibers without resistance, becoming not just a place to rest, but a canvas for the light's slow story. And by the time the full patch of sun rests across the boy's torso, his eyes have begun to blink open, not sharply, not with complaint, but with the ease of someone waking into something known, something kind. And he lies there for a moment longer, letting the warmth hold him, letting the day begin in silence. And the room around him listens, not just with ears, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that only truly old homes know, the kind built not of walls, but of repeated mornings, of the sound of breath and birds, and the stretching of light across familiar places. And so the sun continues its soft climb, and the mat holds its light, and the boy, half awake and fully home, stretches just slightly and begins to rise, bringing with him the warmth of that light like a blanket carried across the beginning of a new ordinary day. Folded neatly and placed on a low ledge beside the mat, beneath a section of wall that holds the warmth of the morning sun longer than any other, lies the family's oldest blanket, a piece of thick, loosely woven fabric made from soft, earth-colored threads that have long since faded from their original shade into something gentler, something that resembles the space between brown and beige, between sand and dusk. And though it is folded now with care, edges aligned, and weight evenly distributed. One corner always sags slightly forward, draping over the ledge like a tired arm, never quite conforming to the rest. Its threads looser, its weave stretched thin from years of pulling, of wrapping, of being tucked tightly under feet or shoulders on colder nights. And that corner, more than any other part of the blanket, tells the story of its service. Of countless evenings spent beside the fire, of children wrapped tightly while fevers passed, of early morning stillness when it served not just to warm, but to comfort, to hold something in place. And the woman who remembers the blanket, when it was new, when it was gifted to her as a wedding offering, smiles faintly each time she touches that worn edge, because though it is frayed, though it has lost its strength, it is the part of the blanket that feels most alive. And over the years, as smaller blankets came and went, patched and mended, or given to others, this one remained, always returned to its ledge after use, always the last one placed over a sleeping body when the nights turned too cold for pride. And the boy, still young but not as small as he once was, knows that corner well, has chewed on it as a toddler, has hidden under it during sudden winds, has wrapped it around his knees during storms when the walls seemed too thin to keep out the world. And even now, as he moves about the courtyard, stretching and waking and beginning to gather his small duties, he passes the blanket and gives the sagging corner a quick tug, more out of habit than need, the way one greets an old friend without speaking, and the cloth responds with a soft sway, a rustle barely audible, like leaves brushing each other in a breeze. And the sun now catches the blanket's surface, warming it slowly, revealing the differences in texture between the newer folds and the older stretch, the patch sewn long ago with darker thread, the small burn mark near the edge from a coal that once jumped free from the brazier. And it is not a beautiful blanket by the measure of new things, but it is beautiful in the way that familiar things are, in the softness of repetition, in the kindness of endurance, in the quiet memory it carries in its weight. And should anyone ever suggest it be replaced, the woman would only smile and shake her head, not with defiance, but with the calm certainty of someone who knows that some things are not kept because they are perfect, but because they are true. And so the blanket remains folded neatly each morning, used without ceremony each night, its corner always slightly loose, always ready to be tucked again, touched again, depended on. And in that one small, sagging edge lies the whole rhythm of the home, things used well, cared for simply, and never discarded before their story is done. In the farthest corner of the courtyard, where the sun's reach is briefest and the air stays cool even as the rest of the home begins to stir with quiet warmth, there sits a wide, shallow basin made of heavy fired clay, its edges curved like the rim of a full moon and its surface worn smooth from years of use, not polished deliberately, but shaped slowly by the touch of countless hands and the press of vessels dipping in and out. And this basin, though empty now, though still and quiet and touched only by the occasional drifting leaf, holds in its silence the memory of water, the way it used to shine in the morning light when filled, the way it would ripple when disturbed by ladles and palms, the soft echo it once made when struck by accident with a metal rim. And the woman, now crouching nearby with a small woven fan in her lap, glances toward the basin, not with urgency, but with recognition, as one looks toward an old object that no longer needs to prove its purpose, because its very presence confirms its worth. And the basin, despite being unfilled, despite being cool to the touch and shadowed by the overhanging wall, still plays a role in the slow unfolding of the household's rhythm, waiting to be needed, patient in the way that only stone and clay can be, accepting the passage of time not as loss, but as practice. And perhaps by midday it will hold water again, carried by the boy or his mother, poured slowly from a jar, held at the hip, the water splashing gently against the curved sides, settling into stillness with a surface that reflects the overhead sky. And perhaps it will be used for washing, or for cooling fruits, or for soaking reeds that will be twisted into cord, or maybe it will remain untouched today, its utility postponed, its waiting continued. But even in waiting it is not idle, for the very act of being available, of holding the potential for usefulness, is enough. And the boy, now passing by with his hands damp from the small water pot near the entry, slows slightly as he sees the basin, remembering without speaking the many days he has sat beside it, dipped his feet into its coolness, watched insects land on the surface, heard the slow drip of water falling from a ladle's edge. And he pauses for a moment, rests one hand on its rim, and then continues on, leaving behind only a trace of warmth where his fingers pressed against the clay, and the basin, unmoved and unchanged, stays nestled in its corner, its interior lightly, dusted with the fine silt that the air always carries, its walls bearing the soft stains of seasons past, its base half ringed by a thin line where water once dried in late summer, and overhead a bird calls once from the rooftop, and a breeze stirs the air just enough to send a curled leaf spinning down to land near the basin's edge, where it joins a small collection of others. And even these leaves, gathered gently rather than swept away, seem part of the basin's patience, its quiet collection of the world's slower movements. And when the woman rises at last and walks past it again, she places her palm briefly on its rim in passing, as if acknowledging an old friend, as if saying not yet, but soon, and the basin in its stillness waits without question, cradling both shadow and memory in equal measure, and remaining what it has always been, a vessel for whatever the day might bring. As the last of the day fades from the walls, and the soft indigo of twilight settles gently over the clay and reed of the home, a hush begins to return. Not sudden, not imposed, but flowing in gradually like river mist, threading through doorways, wrapping around the corners of the courtyard, and settling upon the household with a weightless calm that feels familiar, earned, and complete. And the family, having moved through the slow rituals of their evening, the folding of mats, the dimming of the lamp, the setting aside of the bowl and the reed spoon and the water jar, now returns to stillness, each member drawn into the quiet, not by exhaustion but by a kind of ancient rhythm, the internal clock that homes without timepieces still obey. And the boy, now curled beneath the old blanket whose frayed corner rests beside his cheek, breathes evenly, eyes already closed, his limbs heavy with the kind of tiredness that doesn't protest or resist, but simply gives way. And nearby the woman lowers herself onto the mat she has used since her own youth, the woven pattern almost invisible now but still intact, still carrying the memory of every night she has lain upon it, and she rests her hand lightly on her belly, on her breath, on the simple truth that this is her place. And above them, the stars have begun to blink softly into view beyond the narrow opening above the courtyard, and though only a few can be seen from where they lie, they are enough, just enough to remind them that the world continues in its turning, just as their home continues in its silence. And somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, and then the sound dissolves into the warm, dusty dark, and a pot creaks slightly as it cools near the hearth, and the reed curtain moves a little with the gentlest drift of air, and none of it is jarring. None of it disturbs the peace that now pools through every corner of the home. And even the old wooden peg by the wall, now no longer bearing the weight of the basket, which has been moved beside the shelf for morning use, seems to lean back into the clay a little more deeply, as if it too is resting. And the basin in the corner, empty again, catches the last of the day's warmth in its stone and holds it silently, asking nothing. And so the home breathes, if such things can be said to breathe, not with lungs or lips, but with the gentle expansion and contraction of a space that has welcomed the day, held it, and now releases it. And the woman closes her eyes last, her ears still open to every sound, not out of worry, but out of that attentiveness that never fully sleeps, that motherhood makes permanent. And she listens for a moment longer, to the steady exhale of the child, to the sigh of the night, wind against the wall, to the distant murmur of the city beyond, and finally to the deep silence that has returned. And in that silence, there is no emptiness, no loneliness, only fullness, the fullness of a life lived simply, of a night accepted without drama or danger, of a home that holds its people not just with shelter, but with memory. And in that final stillness, as all things settle into the gentle grip of sleep, the house becomes a single breathing being, not made of brick or straw or stone alone, but of ritual and rhythm and rest. And in that place, on that mat beneath the stars and behind the reed curtain, the boy and his mother fall completely into slumber, and the night unfolds, slow and silent, like a blanket drawn gently over the world.